Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You've survived a pandemic that wiped out almost half of Europe. So yeah, you probably won't survive this either, but let's pretend it's the mid to late 1300s and the Black Deadliest has finally retreated into the shadowy corners of memory, leaving behind a continent that feels hollow. Empty streets, abandoned cottages, church bells tolling for no one. But the real question is, what happens after the end of the world? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to chase you with a mace over it. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching this down in the comments. I love knowing who else is awake during these quiet hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a village that no longer feels like home. Half your neighbours are dead. The baker's boy, gone. The smith who used to shout over his forge, silence. Even the church feels subdued, like God himself has gone into hiding. You step outside and the air is still thick with that eerie quiet, like the earth is holding its breath. Crows dominate the rooftops now. Nature's moving back in faster than anyone expected. You're not alone, but it feels that way. Survivors don't talk much, they just look at each other across empty fields with that 1,000-yard stare. There's this collective disbelief in the air, a murmur of, "What now?" whispered beneath every action. Some people fall into strange rituals, others start rebuilding gardens and patching up fences like nothing ever happened. The rhythms of life try to restart, but they keep skipping beats. What you might not realise is that the world is already shifting beneath your feet. With so many people gone, there's an eerie abundance of everything: tools, land, clothing, even houses. There's no need to fight for resources anymore, because, well, no one's left to fight you for them. You wander through once busy market towns where stalls sit untouched and shop doors hang open. It feels like you're in a haunted museum, except it's your own life under glass. You pause outside a small stone cottage. The door creaks as you push it open. Inside there's a chair tipped over and a jug of dried milk on the table. Dust coats everything. No bodies, just absence. You close the door again, gently. It's not your home, but it might be if you wanted it. In this new world, ownership has gone soft around the edges. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and the other 10th is hoping no one else wants it. Historically, this strange vacuum creates something rare: mobility. For the first time in generations, the rigid social structure of medieval Europe begins to crack. You might be a serf today, but if the lord of the manor died, along with his heirs, well, congratulations. You just inherited your freedom by default. No parade, just fewer chains. Not exactly emancipation, but it's something. You pass by a manor house where the windows are all dark. The family left or died or vanished into some monastery far away. A few bold locals have started poking around the property. A goat now lives in the front garden. A small boy chases a chicken through what used to be the orchard. You get the sense that the old rules died with the plague, but new ones haven't replaced them yet. There's something kind of peaceful about it all. In a morbid way, the chaos has ebbed, the stench of rot has faded, and now there's space to think, to feel. That constant background hum of medieval life, the struggle to feed, obey, and survive, has dimmed. It's like someone hit pause on civilization and forgot to press play again. The silence is more than quiet, it's heavy. Of course, not everything is turning inward and reflective. In some cities, wild rumours swirl. That the end was divine punishment, that another plague is coming, that comets, earthquakes and blood rains will herald round two. The mentally fragile, the deeply religious, and the just plain weird start doing strange things. Wandering mystics preach on corners, processions march through towns, chanting hymns and whipping themselves bloody. But that's a tale for another night. Right now, you're just trying to survive the aftermath. You try planting turnips, because why not? You barter a blanket for a bit of salted fish. You find yourself looking for other survivors, not to rebuild society, but just to talk, to share the ache of it all. Sometimes it feels like you're drifting through someone else's dream, a half-abandoned memory of what life used to be. Here's a fact you didn't ask for. In some towns, bells rang continuously for days after the worst waves of the Black Death passed. Not to mourn the dead, but to drive away what people believed were evil spirits lingering in the air. The idea of miasma, bad air, was everywhere. No one really knew what caused the plague, but they knew they didn't want it coming back. bells, incense, bonfires, a desperate kind of spiritual Febreze. And now for something fringe. There are records of people holding full-on death feasts to celebrate their survival. Giant meals, music, sometimes even hiring performers to play out dances with skull masks, like a medieval version of Mardi Gras, but somehow way creepier. Imagine trying to enjoy a roast goose while someone in a bone costume mimics your grandma's death. That's therapy, 14th century style. As for debates, oh, there are plenty. Scholars still argue about just how much this period really changed Europe. Some say it broke the back of feudalism. Others say that's just wishful thinking, and lords adapted by tightening control where they could. What's clear is that you right now are living in one of history's few honest-to-God reset buttons. No guarantees, just possibilities. You settle in for the evening in a cottage that used to belong to someone else. The fire crackles, and the shadows shift gently on the wall. The world isn't fixed. It might never be. But for the first time it feels like it's waiting for something, or maybe even for you. The morning creeps in slowly, as if even the sun is unsure whether it should bother rising. You stretch out on a straw-stuffed mattress, the smell of old wood smoke clinging to your clothes. Outside, dew clings to the grass, and there's a heavy stillness hanging over everything, like the air itself is waiting for someone to tell it what to do next. When you step outside, the fields roll on green and mostly untouched, and empty. So empty. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it took labour, and you can feel it. No plough lines carved into the dirt, no sound of cartwheels, no shouts from a busy field, just silence and weeds doing their slow, patient rebellion. If you look around, there are entire acres going wild. Grain fields that once fed a village now stand abandoned, the stalks yellowing into disuse. Here's the thing, death made space, a lot of it, and it left no one in charge. But you're still standing, and in this new broken chessboard of a world, that means something. There's land everywhere, usable, fertile, unclaimed land. Entire plots, sometimes entire villages, left behind by families who never made it through the coughing and the boils and the terrifying, merciless weeks of fever. You can take a walk in any direction and find a house with the door hanging open, dishes still on the table, and no one coming back to claim it. It's grim, yes, but it's also opportunity. Prices start to act strangely. Land, which once was the dream of kings and nobles and the fantasy of every peasant, is suddenly a buyer's market, if buying is even a thing anymore. It's more like squatting with style. You move in, plant a few vegetables, maybe take in a stray goat, and wait to see if anyone's going to stop you. Spoiler alert, they won't. In some places, lords try to act like it's business as usual. They issue decrees, they bark orders, they slap together legal documents reminding you that you, technically, still owe them your labour. But without enough people to enforce those orders, or even enough peasants to obey them, those documents become just paper. Torn, burned, used to start fires, and so do a few of the lords, actually, not a metaphor. Some manor houses get mysteriously torched when their owners try to force the old ways back into place. Now here's your historical fact of the night. In England, there was an official attempt to freeze wages and bind workers to their employers, called the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers in 1351. The government basically said, hey, just because half of you are dead doesn't mean you get a raise. Shockingly, it didn't go over well. Enforcement was spotty, punishments were often ignored, and labourers kept walking off jobs and demanding better pay anyway. You know, the start of that delicious concept called worker power. And that's where you come in. You're no longer a voiceless, faceless peasant. You're not just background scenery in a tapestry. You have options now. That abandoned mill downriver, yours if you can get it working. That fallow farmland by the woods, take it. In the weird medieval post-apocalypse, ambition suddenly matters. You can take your fate by the calloused hands and start changing things. Here's a quirky detail. Some people got so excited about all the open land and newfound wealth that they started taking on way more than they could handle. Like 5 farms, 2 cottages, a cow herd, a fishing pond. Ambitious? Sure. Realistic? Not really. Turns out running a small medieval empire is exhausting, especially when you've only got one surviving cousin and a half-drunk neighbour to help. Also, squatters' disputes get spicy. You're not the only one out here claiming abandoned property. Fights break out. People draw imaginary boundary lines with sticks. sometimes literal sticks. The phrase "get off my land" takes on a much more urgent tone when your land used to belong to a monastery and my land has the best surviving apple trees in the region. Meanwhile, the lords and the clergy start sweating a little, because it's not just land that's changing hands, it's power. The pyramid of medieval society, which once looked so solid, king at the top, peasants at the bottom, is starting to wobble. Not collapse, but definitely tilt. You can feel it in the way the steward at the manor house suddenly tries to be polite, the way the abbot offers you bread with a smile instead of a sermon. They're scared. Because if people like you start realizing how much power you now have, well, what's next? Democracy? Don't get too excited, it's still the 1300s. Still, this era isn't exactly all rags to riches montages. With land available and food prices dropping, the economic seesaw gets wonky. More land equals more food, yes, but fewer people to harvest it means spoilage, waste, and a general sense of, well, we tried. Plus, just because you can take over a field doesn't mean you know how to farm it properly. Half the survivors are now amateur agronomists out of necessity, and the harvest results are, oh, mixed. Scholars debate this period a lot. Some see it as the great turning point when the rigid feudal system started to loosen. Others argue that the real change didn't happen till centuries later, and what we're seeing here is more of a temporary shuffle, a glitch in the system, rather than a reboot. But when you look out across the land you've claimed, the silence where a bustling village once stood, the sheep wandering through someone's formal garden, you can't help but feel like the world is tipping. You sit down on a mossy stone wall that used to mark the edge of someone's property. The stones are cool under your hands, and somewhere a bird calls out, lonely, echoing across the fields. You think about the people who once owned this land, the ones who danced during harvest, argued at market, whispered by candlelight. They're gone now, but you're still here, and somehow in the middle of all this wreckage the land waits for you. Patient, empty, ready. You're leaning on a shovel that isn't yours, on land that wasn't yours either, and someone down the path just called you master. You almost laugh. You, a master? Of what? Dirt and debt and a pig that may or may not be pregnant? But they weren't joking. That's how weird things have gotten. You look around and realise that your status, whatever it was before, has started to blur. Your name might not be etched into a family crest, but it suddenly matters. People are listening when you speak. You ask someone to fetch water and they do it. Not because they have to, because they think they should. That's new. That's power. It's all because of numbers. You live in a post-plague economy where humans are the rarest commodity. For the first time in memory, peasants, serfs, villains, cotters, all those folks ground under the wheel of the feudal machine have bargaining power. With fewer hands to till the land, tend the flocks, or spin wool, every warm body becomes valuable. And you, warm body that you are, suddenly have leverage. You walk into a nearby village, if you can still call it that. It's more like a collection of half-repaired roofs and suspicious goats. There's a man there offering coin, actual coin, for someone to mend his fences and help with the harvest. Not labour owed, not corvée, paid. You take the job, you get paid, then you take your payment and walk to the next village, where someone else offers more. And just like that, the sacred order of you owe your lord everything starts to dissolve. Slowly, quietly, like ink bleeding through parchment. Historical fact time. By the late 1300s, there are records of peasants demanding and receiving higher wages, better working conditions, and even mobility. That's a huge deal in a world where moving off the estate used to be a punishable offence. In some places, entire groups of labourers would go on the equivalent of medieval strike, refusing to work unless their terms were met. It's not unions yet, but it's the spiritual prequel. The irony is delicious. The elite tried so hard to maintain control. Laws were passed, sermons were preached, and angry letters were sent between bishops and kings. But none of it mattered when you could just walk away from a bad deal and find someone else desperate for your work. Imagine telling your former lord, "No thanks, I'm going freelance," and then actually getting away with it. Of course, nothing this dramatic happens without some pushback. You feel it in the shifting tone of the church sermons, suddenly all about humility, duty, and staying in your place. You hear it in the grumbles of landowners muttering about uppity peasants, and you definitely see it in the way the laws start tightening again, threatening fines or jail for workers who ask for too much, but none of it sticks, not really. Because the thing about leverage is that once you know you have it, it's impossible to unknow. You start to see small rebellions everywhere. Not the pitchfork and torch kind, not yet, but the kind where people say no and don't get punished for it. A boy refuses to apprentice with the blacksmith and takes up weaving instead. A widow sells her husband's tools and moves to her cousin's estate to start over. 2 field workers band together and negotiate better terms for a whole group. These aren't revolutions. They're quiet reboots. Here's a weird little footnote for you. In some towns, wealth redistribution gets so intense that peasants start buying actual silverware, not owning just a spoon, but multiple pieces. Sets, even. The kind of fancy stuff that used to live only in the manor house. You, a peasant, now eat soup with a real spoon, and maybe even use a second one for dessert if you're feeling extra bold. Post-plague flex. But not everything is fair or fun. There's tension brewing just under the surface. You've got the church trying to maintain its spiritual monopoly, nobles clinging to their tattered privilege, and governments passing panicked laws trying to glue the crumbling hierarchy back together. The king says you're still a subject, the priest says you're still a sinner, but your neighbour just offered you double pay if you help him plant barley, and honestly, that's more persuasive. One day you hear about a distant village that had a full-on revolt. Not swords and blood yet, but dozens of workers walking out of the fields mid-harvest, demanding higher pay, shouting slogans, not in Latin or legalese, but in rough, angry, very unholy English. You tilt your head and think, could you do that too? What if everyone around you just stopped obeying? Who would stop you? A sheriff with no deputies? A bishop with no tithes? And that's the dangerous part. The old world had laws, yes, but more than that, it had habits, inherited roles, learned obedience. Now, with the threads unravelling, people are remembering how to question. That may be more powerful than any sword. A world where a ploughman can choose his employer, a servant can walk away, and a serf can ask, why though? That's a world with tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. Here's the scholarly debate. Was this the real beginning of the end for medieval feudalism? Some say yes, that this labour power snowballed into peasant revolts, legal reforms, and eventually the market-driven economies of modern Europe. Others argue that it was more of a temporary imbalance, that feudalism limped on for centuries in various forms, but standing where you are, watching someone in patched clothes haggle like a merchant, it feels like something big is breaking open. You head home, your new home, cobbled together from parts of your old life and whatever the plague didn't steal. On the way, you pass 3 people arguing over how to split a piece of farmland. No lord, no steward, no armed guard, just voices raised, hands gesturing, and eventually, agreement. Not because someone enforced it, but because they had to work together. Cooperation as necessity. Not quite democracy, but a shadow of it. You get back, light a small fire, and sit with a bowl of porridge that you made from grain you didn't have to steal or beg for. The walls around you are crooked. The roof leaks when it rains. But this is yours, and when you go to sleep tonight, you'll do it knowing that tomorrow someone might call you master again, and not in jest. The church bell rings, but it sounds different now, hollow, like it knows its authority is starting to slip. You glance up at the chapel as you pass, the roof sagging on one side, and the once pristine whitewash has started to flake off in patches. The priest isn't outside greeting villagers like he used to. In fact, you're not even sure where he is. Ever since the plague, clergy have been thinner on the ground, both literally and metaphorically. You remember when the Black Death was at its peak, and people begged the church for answers, for mercy, for a miracle. And what did they get? A lot of incense, a few half-hearted processions, maybe a priest who ran off to his country estate when the bodies started piling up. Or worse, one who stayed, got infected, and died mid-mass. That kind of thing really knocks the halo off an institution. So now, with the air clearer and the silence settled, you start wondering, what if the church doesn't know everything? What if it never did? A dangerous thought in the wrong company, but you're not alone in thinking it. People have started talking more openly, asking questions, side-eyeing sermons, wondering why the folks who claim to speak for God couldn't even predict the end of the world, much less prevent it. Here's your historical fact. In many areas, especially rural ones, the plague wiped out an entire generation of priests. The replacements, often rushed through training, underqualified or, in some cases, openly corrupt. The church needed bodies, so standards dropped. And you, sitting there during Mass while some shaky 20-year-old tries to remember Latin verbs, start thinking, this guy is no closer to God than I am. And it gets weirder. Some towns go months or years without a single church service. No weddings, no confessions, no communion. Just empty pews and crumbling altars. People adapt. They start praying at home, lighting candles in their own kitchens, burying the dead themselves. Religion becomes a DIY project. Less formal, but somehow more personal. And once you've built your own altar, it's hard to be impressed by a gilded one. There are also rumours, whispers about new movements forming in the shadows. Preachers who walk from town to town not with gold-threaded robes, but dusty cloaks and ragged shoes. They don't quote scripture the same way. They talk about simplicity, about justice, about how God doesn't need a church to speak. Some folks are drawn to them like moths to a lantern. Others are terrified. And then there are the truly wild ones, Flagellants. You hear them before you see them, the chanting, the dull rhythm of whip against flesh. They march through villages like a human storm, faces twisted in agony or ecstasy, you're not sure which. They believe the plague was punishment for sin, and their response is to beat it out of themselves, publicly and violently. It's part performance, part hysteria, and fully unsettling. The fringe fact: in some places, flagellant processions were banned by the church itself. Too disruptive, too unorthodox, too loud in their critique of established religious structures. Imagine being so intense in your faith that the church tells you to tone it down. But for people living in a world that just ended and restarted, it makes sense. The normal rules don't feel sacred anymore. The broken world needs broken rituals. Back in your own village, the chapel is still technically functional, but no one seems eager to go. You remember when it was the centre of everything: births, deaths, marriages, holidays, taxes. Now it's more like an echo chamber. You do still hear the bells now and then, but they sound more like a habit than a command. What's really happening is this: faith is detaching from structure. People still believe. Of course they do. But it's less centralised now, less rigid. When catastrophe levels everything, belief becomes more about survival than doctrine. You hear a widow down the lane praying to saints no one's officially approved. Someone else leaves bread out for spirits they say protect the household. No one's correcting them. The spiritual world has blown wide open. And of course the upper echelons of the church are not thrilled. Bishops send letters, synods are called. There's a lot of concern about heresy. That word starts popping up a lot more in conversation. Heresy here, heresy there. It becomes the new plague, the one they can control, or at least think they can. But every time they silence a wandering preacher, another 3 take his place. The scholars argue over this one, too. Was the post-plague decline in church authority the beginning of the Protestant Reformation? Some say yes, that this is when people began to shift their trust away from Rome and toward personal belief. Others say it was more of a slow disillusionment, a crack that widened over generations. Either way, you're living in the middle of the fracture, and you feel it in small ways. When you don't bother to attend Mass, when you skip confession and no one says anything, when you catch yourself looking at the stars and thinking maybe, just maybe, the answers aren't in the scriptures at all. You'd never say that out loud, of course, but you think it. And so does your neighbour, and the woman who sells herbs and prays in her own language. You spend a quiet evening in your cottage, watching the candle flicker in the draught. Your rosary beads hang untouched on the wall. You believe still, but it's different now. Less fear, more curiosity, less obedience, more space. The silence where ritual used to be is oddly comforting. You wonder if maybe this is closer to real faith than all those gold chalices and embroidered vestments ever were. And when the wind howls through the trees later that night, and you say a quick prayer, not to Saint whoever, but just into the dark, you realise that, plague or no plague, something fundamental has changed. You used to kneel in a church and ask for protection. Comes. Now you stand on your own land, look up at the sky and ask for understanding. The wind is sharper today, and there's a rawness to it that makes the back of your neck tense. You wrap your cloak tighter and glance down the road, because you hear them before you see them. A low, rhythmic thud, then voices, chanting loud and breathless, as if someone is shouting their soul out through their ribs. And then, around the bend, they appear, the Flagellants. You step back instinctively, into the shadow of a low stone wall, watching them pass. Barefoot, mud-splattered, stripped to the waist even though the wind bites like a blade. Their backs are already bloodied, red streaks crossing like crude handwriting. They march in strange unison, swinging flails over their shoulders and bringing them down hard over and over in perfect painful rhythm. A human metronome of misery. You wonder if they even feel it anymore. A few of them wear hoods, eyes dark and sunken. as if they haven't slept in days. One carries a crude wooden cross, dragging it through the dirt behind him. Another waves a banner painted with a skull and hourglass, your classic post-apocalyptic aesthetic. They chant verses you don't recognise, a mash of Latin and local dialect, half of it probably invented on the spot. People are watching from doorways. No one claps, no one joins, but no one stops them either. This isn't entertainment, it's a warning, a roving sermon of pain and judgment, echoing the idea that the plague wasn't just a biological disaster but a punishment, a divine slap on the wrist, except instead of repenting quietly, these folks went full horror movie about it. Here's your historical fact. The Flagellant movement hit its peak right after the Black Death tore through Europe, especially in Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France. They believed that by publicly punishing themselves, they could atone for the sins of the world and stop the wrath of God. And for a brief chaotic moment, they had serious influence. Crowds followed them. Towns welcomed them. Some people saw them as saints, others as fanatics. The church predictably had mixed feelings. On one hand, sure, public penance is on brand. On the other, this whole unauthorized theological roadshow started attracting a bit too much attention. Some groups even started preaching their own doctrine. No popes, no bishops, no need for confession to a priest, just blood, chanting, and self-delivered punishment. Unsurprisingly, the Vatican clutched its pearls. Eventually, the Pope issued formal bans, and some local leaders cracked down, but the idea, that stuck around like a bad hymn. You don't join the Flagellants, obviously. You're curious, not unhinged, but you do feel something stir as they pass, the tension of a society where people no longer trust the old institutions but haven't yet built new ones. So instead, they turn inward. Or, in this case, outward and very loud. Pain becomes performance. Guilt becomes theatre. And for people still staggering under the weight of loss, fear and survival, that kind of pageantry hits hard. But while the Flagellants march on, other weird post-plague vibes are starting to take root too. You start noticing little shrines popping up in places that don't belong, at crossroads, in abandoned barns carved into the bark of trees. Not the official kind with saints and halos, but homemade ones. Candles, bones, trinkets from the dead. It's like everyone is improvising their own religion now. The world broke, and the rituals spilled out onto the floor like a smashed chalice. Fringe fact time, in a few scattered places, people started worshipping new saints, ones that weren't canonized by the church, but had emerged from local folklore dreams or just straight-up desperation. Saint Tidfil the Plague Shield, Saint Marla of the Candle Flame, totally unofficial, totally made up, and yet people lit candles and left offerings anyway. It's a DIY spirituality buffet, and everyone's building their own combo plate. You walk back through your village, noticing how quiet everything feels in the aftermath of that grim parade. The children didn't come out to watch. The baker's apprentice made the sign of the cross, then hurried inside. People are unsettled, not by the idea of punishment, but by how loud it's become. Because here's the truth. Even if they don't say it aloud, most folks are done with suffering. They've had their fill. The thought of adding more to it voluntarily feels like pouring vinegar into a wound. And that's the debate that's starting to crack open. Is suffering virtuous, or is it just pointless? The pre-plague world loved a good martyr story, starving nuns, burned saints, holier men sleeping on nails. But now, after watching half the population die screaming in the streets, people are starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, comfort and peace aren't sinful. Maybe they're sacred too. Some scholars argue that the Flagellants and similar movements were a last gasp of the medieval worldview, a desperate, a bloody attempt to put the spiritual genie back in the bottle. Others say they were the first warning signs of a deep spiritual reshuffling, one that would lead to reformation, rebellion, and eventually an entire new world. Either way, you've just seen it up close and it'll stick with you. That sound of whip hitting skin is not easy to forget. Later that evening, you hear someone singing. It's not a hymn. Just a soft lullaby, probably sung to calm a fussy child, but it carries on the wind and wraps itself around the village like a blanket. It's the kind of sound that reminds you people are still here, still living, still choosing softness in a world that tried to erase it. You sit by the hearth and stir a pot of soup, onions, barley, a bit of salt pork. You eat slowly, quietly. There's no flagellation, no Latin chant, just the crackle of firewood and the breath of wind against the shutter. You think about those marching men, walking into the next village, their backs bleeding, their voices raw, and you wonder if they'll ever feel peace again, or if they gave it up, convinced they didn't deserve it. You, though, you're not giving yours up. You survived. And in this strange, broken, reshaping world, that might be the most sacred act of all. You set out early the next morning, following a dirt path that used to connect 3 or 4 villages. Now it connects 1.5. The air is cool, the kind of damp that clings to your sleeves and seeps into your bones. You pass fallow fields where tall grass has swallowed the boundaries, where hedgerows have grown thick and wild. The earth has started to reclaim what people no longer can. Then you see it, off to the right through a row of dying birch trees, a village, or what's left of one. You climb a low ridge to get a better look, and the first thing you notice is the silence. There's no smoke, no dogs barking, no one out tending to chores. Roofs are caved in, doors hang open, a crumpled cart rests where someone abandoned it mid-journey, like they just got tired of trying. You step carefully between the houses. Some are half-looted, stripped clean by wandering scavengers, or maybe survivors from nearby settlements. Others still hold the dust of the past like a museum no one visits. Dried herbs still hang from the rafters of one cottage. A wooden cup split down the middle rests beside a cradle. You peer into a small church with no door, and inside sunlight filters through the rafters, lighting up a single pew that still stands upright. The rest is rubble. God left here a long time ago. This isn't a rare sight. It's just the first time you've seen it up close. Entire towns vanished during the Black Death. Not just in death toll, but in presence. People fled, or they died, or they never returned. Some villages were so depopulated they were simply erased from the maps. No heirs, no tenants, no livestock, no records. Just absence. Here's your historical fact. In England alone, over 300 villages were completely abandoned in the wake of the plague. Some were already struggling before, but the pandemic pushed them over the edge. Today they're known as lost villages. Their names half remembered in old legal documents or carved faintly on forgotten stones. And you, standing in one now, feel the full weight of what lost actually means. You sit on a crumbling stone step and look out across the village green, now just a tangled patch of weeds and rabbit holes. It's strange to think about all the lives that happened here. Births, marriages, petty arguments over chickens. You wonder if they had any idea their homes would one day be this quiet, that all their effort, all their little rituals and rhythms could just vanish like smoke. And it's not just here. On your way back, you hear stories from travellers, entire valleys with nothing left but ruins. Churches with cracked bells that haven't rung in years. Towns overtaken by forest where deer now walk through the market square. One man tells you about a village where everyone died so fast, no one was buried. He says the bodies are still in the houses, just bones now, sitting at the sun table as if waiting for supper. You don't ask how he knows, but in all that emptiness, something strange happens. Nature moves in. Trees grow through collapsed roofs. Ivy crawls across altars. Birds nest in the rafters of barns. You see foxes in the streets and hear owls in the chapel. It's eerie, yes, but also oddly beautiful, like the world is healing itself in the quiet. You get the sense that the earth isn't grieving like you are, it's just adjusting. Fringe fact? There are accounts, some real, some probably exaggerated, of people wandering into deserted towns and claiming them as their own. Just walking in, moving into a house and pretending they'd always lived there. Changing their names, reinventing themselves. It's hard to verify, of course, but the idea is so perfectly medieval meets post-apocalyptic that you kind of want it to be true. Reinvention through ruin. And that's where a strange debate among scholars kicks in. Some believe that this era led to an early form of psychological detachment, like survivors had to mentally distance themselves from the trauma by literally walking away from it. Abandoning homes, starting over, cutting ties with everything they'd known. Others argue that people tried to hold on, that they fought to maintain the memory of their villages even as the structures crumbled. You stand here looking at an empty cottage and you're not sure which side is right. There's a kind of stillness in these places that settles into your skin. You start to notice the sound of your own breath, the weight of your own footsteps. You feel like you're trespassing, not on someone's property, but on their memory. Every broken roof tile feels like a question. Where did they go? Why didn't they come back? You don't have answers, but you keep walking anyway. At one point you pass a well with a stone rim cracked down the middle. A long-dead vine has wrapped itself around the handle of the pulley. You drop a pebble inside and wait. No splash, just the echo trailing off into a silence that has depth. This village isn't just abandoned, it's sealed, like a book that's been closed and forgotten on a high shelf. By the time you get back home, the sun is starting to dip behind the hills. Your cottage, patched, uneven, but full of life, feels different now, warmer. You light a fire, make a pot of stew, and sit in the doorway watching the shadows stretch across the road. The emptiness you saw today doesn't scare you. Not exactly, but it does make everything you've rebuilt feel a little more precious. You sleep lightly that night, and you dream of empty towns. In the dream, you walk through them barefoot, and the grass grows faster behind you with every step. Doors open as you pass, windows blink like eyes. And from the ruined bell towers, a soft, ghostly chime rings out, not to warn, but to welcome, as if the lost places remember. You wake up thinking about bones, not in the creepy, haunted crypt sort of way, though there's plenty of that going around, but in the what do we do with all the dead kind of way. Because here's the thing no one really talks about during the plague itself. There were too many bodies, far too many, and not enough time or hands or holy water to handle them all properly. So now, after the storm has passed, you're left with a second, quieter problem, the debris of death. You lace your boots and walk out into the pale morning light. The sky's overcast, the kind of dull grey that makes everything feel like an oil painting left unfinished. You're heading to the next village over, where someone said they're building a new chapel. Not because the old one burned or crumbled, but because they want to remember, commemorate, atone. You're not sure what word fits anymore. The road winds through low hills, past a small orchard someone's trying to revive. A girl waves to you from atop a ladder, basket at her hip, plucking half-ripe apples with methodical calm. A few months ago, she wouldn't have made eye contact. Now, everyone wants to feel connected, even just in passing. When you arrive at the chapel site, you stop short. It's not what you expected. There's no grand construction, no massive stoneworks or ornate designs, just a circle of stones, carefully laid. At the centre, a wooden cross, plain and upright, flanked by 2 candles in clay holders. A small group is gathered, maybe a dozen people, sitting or kneeling, some holding hands, others just staring at the ground. You learn it's not actually a chapel, it's a memory circle. A place to sit with grief. One man speaks softly about his wife who died in spring. A woman mentions her mother and 2 sons. A child, no older than 6, simply points to the sky. No one tells them to hush, no one rushes. It's not a service, it's not a performance. It's something raw and honest and very, very quiet. This is the new kind of remembrance. Not mass graves, not endless tolling bells, but spaces. Spaces for mourning that aren't just about the dead, but about the living trying to understand what survival even means. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, there was a sharp increase in the construction of chantry chapels and memorial foundations across Europe. Wealthier survivors would pay to have prayers said for their souls after death, in perpetuity. Entire buildings were dedicated to this idea, eternal intercession to keep the memory and the soul safe. But for common folk, memory lived in small acts, naming a child after the deceased, lighting a candle every feast day, building a stone circle in an empty field. You help carry stones for a bit. No one asks why you're helping, and no one thanks you either. It's not that kind of gathering. Grief has levelled social roles just as thoroughly as the plague levelled the population. Everyone here has lost someone. Many have lost everyone. But grief doesn't just stop at chapels and memory circles. You see it in the art too. Back home, someone's carved a figure into the lintel above their door. A dancing skeleton, grinning, arms raised. A danse macabre, they call it. You start to notice them everywhere. Murals, woodcuts, tiny figures etched into church pews or painted into the margins of prayer books. Death, not as an end, but as a companion, a jester, a warning, a joke with the worst punchline. Fringe fact, in some towns, people created whole plague processions with actors wearing masks of skulls and angels, walking through the streets every year to remind everyone of mortality. Not just to mourn, but to cope. It sounds strange, but when you've seen that much death, laughter becomes its own survival tactic. You start to understand why some survivors make jokes about the plague. Macabre humour is the world's cheapest therapy. At the same time, charitable acts bloom like mushrooms after rain. Almshouses expand. Orphanages appear in places that never needed them before. The lucky, the healthy, and the newly wealthy begin to sponsor soup kitchens, distribute grain, even adopt stray children. Cynics say it's guilt. Maybe it is, but also maybe it's recognition. An unspoken acknowledgement that surviving obligates you to something. You start doing small things yourself, dropping off extra loaves of bread to the neighbour who lost her husband, sharpening the tools of the old man who hasn't spoken since midsummer. You don't expect thanks, you just do it. Not out of nobility, but because it helps make sense of the silence, and because doing something beats standing still in the aftershock. There's a scholar in the next town who writes letters to no one. He says he writes to the dead, and every few weeks he burns the letters in a clean fire. You see him at the market once, pale and blinking like he hasn't spoken to a living soul in days, but when you greet him he smiles, not big, just enough. You remember that look, that still trying look, the debate among historians, whether these post-plague acts of charity and memory were truly altruistic or simply transactional. If I do this, maybe God won't smite me next time. Honestly, standing there among people laying down stones and telling stories to the wind, the academic debate feels like noise. Whether it's fear or love or grief, what matters is that people are doing something. That night you light a candle, not in a church, not in front of a shrine, just in your window. You sit with it for a while, watching the flame twitch. You think of your sister, of the boy who used to throw rocks into the river, who didn't come back after the fever. You think of the smell of sickness, the way the village went silent, the day the bell stopped ringing because no one was left to ring it. The candle burns low. You don't cry. You've done enough of that. You just sit, and you remember, and somehow that's enough. There's a moment, maybe halfway through the morning, when you realise someone's wearing red hose, bright red, not crimson or wine-coloured or some dusty burgundy, but cherry, borderline, scandalous red. It catches your eye like a flame across a foggy field. And here's the strange part. No one seems shocked. A few glances, maybe a raised eyebrow or two, but that's it. You stop to stare, not at the person really, but at the idea of it. Colour, boldness, flair, right here in the middle of what should still be a grieving age. You weren't expecting fashion to be a consequence of the plague, but it is. Oh, it absolutely is. Because here's the thing, the world got crack-keyed open, and when it did, a whole lot of unspoken rules fell out. People who never had money suddenly do. People who never had choices now have options. And when you're no longer starving or dying or being told exactly what colour cloth you're allowed to wear based on your social rank, what do? You get creative and a little unhinged. You see it in town. The tunics are shorter now, especially on the younger crowd. Men are showing more leg. Women too. Sleeves have started flaring again, and hats have gone from practical to peacocking. There's a woman at the market wearing a veil so long it brushes the ground behind her like a bridal train. A man selling salt is wearing shoes with curled toes that look like they belong in a fairy tale. These aren't nobles, these are people, survivors, and apparently they are done dressing like ghosts. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, there was a documented uptick in luxurious clothing, even among the lower classes, because with wages rising and so many wealthy families wiped out, common folk suddenly had disposable income, and fewer people telling them how to use it. This led to a short, glorious, totally chaotic boom in fashion. Velvet, silk, furs, embroidery items, once reserved for the elite, started showing up on the backs of people who were previously forbidden to even touch them. You remember those old sumptuary laws, the ones that dictated exactly what a merchant could wear versus a noble? Yeah, well, they're still on the books, but enforcement is relaxed, let's say. Mostly because the enforcers are either dead or currently embroidering their own doublets with golden thread. Of course, the authorities try. In some cities, edicts are passed to shame people back into modesty. One particularly bitter lord declares that anyone wearing fur without the appropriate title is an offence to the eyes of God. Meanwhile, the baker's daughter shows up in fur-trimmed sleeves the very next day. Coincidence? Doubtful. Fringe fact for you, there's actually a recorded moment when men's shoes got so pointy, absurdly, impractically pointy, that laws were passed to limit how long the tips could be. One style, the Krakow, could extend up to 2 feet beyond the toes. People stuffed the ends with some moss or wool to keep them upright. You imagine tripping over your own fashion and wonder how many sprained ankles were worth the aesthetic. It's not just vanity, though. Dressing up is a signal you've lived through something awful and now you want to be seen. Not just as someone who made it, but as someone who matters. Someone who can define themselves by more than their labour or their surname or their guild membership. You wear red hose not because you're trying to show off, but because for the first time in your life you can. And there's a deeper, stranger shift underneath it all. The aesthetics of mourning are starting to change. Instead of sackcloth and ashes, people lean into contrast. Dark silk with bright trim, black sleeves edged with silver thread. The symbolism evolves. Death is acknowledged, but life is emphasized. You begin to see beauty not as defiance, but as memory. Every bright garment becomes a whispered still here. That's the debate, of course, whether this plague fashion bloom was shallow excess or something more meaningful. Some scholars argue that it was just a temporary spike in luxury consumption, a historical sugar rush before the next famine. Others say it was part of a broader shift toward individuality, early signs of a society slowly inching toward personal identity, taste, and even self-expression. You sit on a low stone bench at the edge of the marketplace, watching the parade of colours and shapes pass you by. It's not a fashion show, it's just Tuesday. But you notice something else. People smile more. Maybe not wide, open grins, this is still a traumatised generation, but there's a looseness in the shoulders, a softness in the eyes. And when someone laughs, it doesn't sound out of place anymore. You think about your own clothes, the old tunic, the faded cloak, and for the first time you feel a bit outdated. Not poor exactly, but quiet in a world that's starting to sing again. You run a hand over the cloth and wonder what you'd choose if you had the coin. Dark green velvet? Maybe those ludicrous shoes with the curled toes? Would you wear a feathered hat if no one told you not to? You head back home past a group of children playing in the street. One has a makeshift crown on their head, a twisted loop of reeds decorated with berries. They proclaim themselves King of Autumn, and the others cheer. No adults stop them. No one corrects them. The world is too new, too tender for rules like that. That evening you borrow a needle and thread from the weaver next door. You sit by the fire, patching your cloak, not just to mend it, but to change it. You stitch a thin border of blue along the hem. It's not much, but it's something. When you drape it over your shoulders the next morning, it feels a little warmer. You never expected to crave meat, not like this, not in that daydreaming about roasted goose while picking weeds from your garden kind of way. You'd been raised on porridge, root vegetables, and whatever your family could coax from stubborn soil. Meat was rare, an indulgence for feast days or weddings, not an everyday thing. But now there's bacon sizzling in someone's pan 3 doors down, and it smells like a miracle. You follow the scent on instinct. It leads you to a small cottage, where a boy barely out of childhood is tending a skillet over a fire. You recognise him. His parents both died last year. He lives with his aunt now. He waves you over without a word, just lifts a chunk of meat from the pan and offers it on a bit of brown bread. You thank him, sit beside the fire and take a bite. It's rich, salty, slightly overcooked, but that just makes the fat a little crispy around the edges. You chew slowly, savouring it like it's a poem. And the strangest thing, you're not surprised anymore. Food is changing, diet is changing. The world is once again shuffling its hierarchy, and this time it's rearranging who gets to eat what. See, with half the population gone, the usual demand on farmland dropped dramatically. Fields went fallow, yes, but more importantly, grain prices plummeted. Wheat, barley, oats, they were suddenly cheap, abundant, even unwanted in some places. And when grain stopped being the lifeblood of every meal, people started looking around for something else to eat. And what did they find? Livestock. Pigs, chickens, goats, sheep wandering unattended through meadows, cattle unclaimed. Suddenly, if you had a little initiative and a strong stomach, you could feed yourself better than you ever had. Protein wasn't a luxury anymore, it was just there. Historical fact break. After the Black Death, diets across Europe noticeably improved for the lower classes. Archaeological studies even show improved bone health in the generation following the plague, likely due to increased access to meat and dairy. Imagine that. Death brings devastation, but also better nutrition. Welcome to the paradox of plague. You help the boy gather kindling and spend the rest of the morning talking about the changes in the local market. He says people have stopped hoarding food like they used to. He even jokes about meat fatigue. Too much pork, not enough variety. His aunt is pickling onions. They are trading eggs for honey now. Someone down the road makes cheese every 3 days. What used to be rare is becoming routine, and people are adjusting faster than anyone expected. But not everyone is celebrating. The old order, lords, estate managers, clergy, they're starting to notice that peasants are eating too well. Some even declare it sinful. One local abbot delivers a sermon about gluttony, casting side eyes at the well-fed faces in the congregation. You smirk as he pats his own round belly. No one's exactly in a hurry to go back to cabbage water and dry bread. Fringe fact? Oh yes. There's a case in northern Italy where a group of labourers actually refused an employer's offer of low wages and poor food during harvest season. They wanted meat in their meals, or they'd walk. And walk they did. Imagine the chaos of peasants unionising over stew. And of course, not all the changes are comfortable. With livestock on the rise and grain on the decline, the very structure of farming begins to shift. People start converting their land from crops to pasture. Sheep in particular are becoming the new gold. Wool is profitable, manageable, and doesn't need constant supervision. You see the beginnings of this when a neighbour asks if he can graze his flock in the empty lot where a house used to be. You say yes, of course, what else would you do with it? Here's the tricky bit. Those who adapt thrive. Those who don't, they fade. You see it in the eyes of some older folks who cling to the old ways, insisting that a proper meal must begin with a loaf and end with a prayer. But most people are practical. They start salting pork, brewing more ale, making wild stews with whatever's left at the end of the week. The flavours are rough, but there's comfort in the heat, the fat, the fullness. There's also a growing culture of shared meals. Not the rigid feast days of the church calendar, but informal gatherings. You hear about neighbours pooling resources to throw something called survivors' suppers. People bring whatever they have, root vegetables, dried herbs, baked meat, and spend an evening eating, drinking, and being. Not mourning, not repenting, just living loudly. One night you host one. It's not fancy. Some roast carrots, a barley stew, pickled greens, and a bit of cheese. A friend brings mushrooms. Another brings something she calls apple pudding, which turns out to be mashed apples, honey, and a lot of hope. The food vanishes fast. The laughter lasts longer. There's music too, a boy with a lute, a girl who sings in a voice that still cracks on the high notes. No one minds, no one's beginning. You catch yourself smiling so hard your face aches, and for a moment you feel it, that thing you haven't felt in years, not just hunger satisfied, but pleasure. You go to sleep full that night, not just of food, but of something harder to define, something warm and round and human. The fire dies down slowly. You watch the embers pulse like the last notes of a song. You don't dream of famine or mourning. You dream of clinking mugs, laughter echoing in low-stone cottages, and the smell of something delicious bubbling in a battered iron pot. You wake with a strange clarity. The plague took lives, yes, but it also disrupted everything. That includes hunger, that includes joy, that includes the idea of what a meal means. And maybe, just maybe, that's where healing begins, with a bite of something warm, shared with someone who's still here. There's a new sound in town, and it's not the usual clang of a blacksmith or the low rumble of carts rolling over worn-out cobblestones. It's the unmistakable, slightly absurd creak-snap of a long-beaked mask, turning sharply toward you. You stop walking. The figure in the beaked hood pauses too, just long enough for you to lock eyes, or at least guess where the eyes are, somewhere behind the glass. You're looking at a plague doctor, or, more accurately, someone still dressed like one. He's not here on official business. That much is clear. There's no outbreak, no fresh pits being dug, no panicked villagers throwing herbs into their fireplaces. He's just walking around. Mask on, staff in hand, long coat flapping behind him like he missed the memo that the plague ended years ago. A child peeks out from behind a barrel and whispers, "Why is he still dressed like that?" And the mother pulls them back sharply, as if the question itself might invite something dark to return. The truth is, no one really knows what to do with the plague doctors now. Once they were heroes, or at least necessary evils. They walked into houses no one else would enter. They inspected the boils. They tried not to gag. They wore those bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and spices, believing it might protect them from the foul miasma in the air. For a while they were the closest thing people had to hope, but now they're like scarecrows after harvest, still standing but out of place. Here's your historical fact. The iconic plague doctor mask, the long curved beak stuffed with aromatic materials, was more of a 17th century invention. During the earlier waves of plague in the 14th century, most doctors didn't wear full masks like that. But over time, the image became symbolic of the Black Death itself. It didn't matter if it wasn't accurate, it was memorable and terrifying, which honestly might have been the point. The man in the mask walks past you without a word. The street quiets a little as he goes by like a ripple in a still pond. You hear whispers. He's mad. He lost his whole family. He thinks if he takes it off, it'll come back. The stories grow in the telling. You even hear one version that claims he's not a real man at all, just death, keeping up appearances. You watch him turn the corner and disappear, and you wonder, what happens to the people who were needed only during the crisis? The ones who made their lives out of triage and tragedy, not just plague doctors, but grave diggers, coffin builders, cart drivers who ferried the dead. When death slows down, so does their purpose. And if that purpose was the only thing holding them together, what's left? Some of them pivot. A gravedigger you knew has started carving headstones, artful ones, full of flowers and birds and hopeful little sunrises. A plague cart driver now delivers ale. The man who used to nail up quarantine signs has taken up woodcutting, though every time he hammers, he flinches like he's waiting for a scream. But others don't adapt. They become ghosts in their own towns, wandering reminders of the worst days. Survivors look at them and remember too much, so they avoid them, cross streets, change topics. Pretend not to see it's not cruelty, it's fatigue. Here's a fringe fact. In some towns, after the final waves of plague faded, people held unofficial cleansing festivals, bonfires where they burned masks, robes and plague charms. Not just to destroy contaminated items, but as a ritual of closure. Some communities even banned the wearing of plague-era garb entirely. No one wanted to be reminded. There's a growing superstition now, unspoken but potent. Don't dress like death unless you want to invite it back. And yet some can't let go. A few self-styled physicians cling to their identity, insisting that their services are still needed. They dabble in dubious remedies, try to sell amulets to ward off residual pestilence, or offer to cleanse homes of lingering evil spirits. You suspect they know their time is over, but saying goodbye to a role is harder than surviving the plague itself. Scholars argue whether the post-plague decline of figures like the plague doctor marks a shift toward modern medicine, or just the fading of one particular kind of desperation. The doctors of the future will wear robes too, but they'll be clean, white, and backed by science, not stuffed with rosemary and wishful thinking. You sit with some friends that evening near the village fire pit. Someone brings up the masked man. The mood dips. People fidget. One woman says she remembers when he visited her father's bedside years ago. He didn't speak, just scribbled something on a parchment, nodded, and left. Her father died the next day. She hasn't spoken to the doctor since. Someone else makes a nervous joke. Maybe he is the plague, just wearing skin like a suit. The group laughs, but not really. You all sit a little quieter after that. Later, you walk home under a sky full of stars. The moon is thin tonight, a sliver of pale light barely strong enough to cast shadows. You pass by the corner where the man disappeared earlier. The air feels colder there, or maybe that's your imagination. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You survived. The plague is gone. And yet, you pause at your door, your hand on the latch. You think about the beaked mask, about the silent walk, about how grief can wear a uniform, and how some people get stuck in their part of the story. You step inside, light a candle, and sit with the warmth. Tomorrow you'll help mend the roof of the chapel. Someone else is baking bread. Life continues, but in the dark corners, behind glass eyes and stitched seams, some shadows linger a little longer. The woman at the edge of town used to be invisible. Midwife, herb seller, widow, one of those people who existed quietly, always on the periphery, called upon only when someone was bleeding or birthing. She never spoke much, and when she did, it was in that soft, flat way that made you wonder if she was thinking of a dozen other things at once. But now, she's running things. You first notice it when you pass her garden. It's thriving ridiculously so. Tall stalks of beans, heavy cabbages, herbs overflowing from woven baskets. She's got people, men even, helping her weed and water. She offers instruction, occasionally corrects them with a single look. No shouting, just calm competence, like she knows what she's doing and everyone else is just catching up. That's the story of a lot of women right now, actually. You start to realize it as the weeks go by. With so many men dead, gone, or wandering, women are stepping into roles no one ever let them near before. And not just by accident, by necessity. Take the local tannery, run now by a widow and her 2 daughters. The youngest one's maybe 14, and she haggles like she's been doing it since birth. The blacksmith's forge? His sister took over after he died. She swings a hammer like it's part of her arm, and over at the grain store, the books are being kept by a former maid who turns out is better at math than any of the men ever were. Funny how that works. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, labour shortages didn't just give peasants leverage, it gave women opportunities. With so many positions unfilled, women stepped into jobs traditionally held by men, milling, brewing, money lending, even running shops or estates. In some regions, widows took control of their late husband's businesses entirely, sometimes permanently, sometimes until sons were old enough to inherit. And in a handful of cases, they simply refused to hand it back. You're watching one of those transitions happen in real time. The woman at the edge of town, her name's Alice, starts holding what she calls women's days. You're not invited, obviously, but you hear about them. Small gatherings in the back garden, sometimes just talking, sometimes reading, sometimes making tinctures and poultices and sharing which more. Your merchant is paying a fair price for wool. Someone says Alice has a book, an actual book, that she's been teaching from. A book of plants and stars and bones, half medicine, half magic. People talk, of course they do. Too much freedom, someone mutters in the marketplace, too much ambition, but no one stops them, because who else is doing the work? You see it in the church too, though less officially. With fewer priests available, women step in to lead prayers, to organise funerals, to tend the sick. Not as a rebellion, just as a response. When the world breaks, everyone grabs the nearest tool and starts hammering things back into place, regardless of whose name is on the handle. But it doesn't last forever. You feel the resistance creeping back in like a cold draft through a cracked wall. New priests are being trained, quickly, poorly, but trained. Officials are writing fresh laws, tightening old ones. You hear about a decree in a nearby city, women barred from practicing certain trades without a male guardian. Another village refuses to accept land rents paid by widows unless a man signs the agreement. Slowly, steadily, the pendulum starts swinging back. Because for every field a woman ploughs, every shop she runs, every tincture she brews, there's someone watching, frowning, waiting for the normal order to reassert itself. And when it does, they're ready. Ready to push women back into kitchens, back into silence, back into the roles they wore before half the world died. Fringe fact. In the decades following the Black Death, some places saw a sharp increase in accusations of witchcraft, often against older women, midwives or widows who had stepped into public authority during the chaos. The overlap between woman with knowledge and dangerous threat became uncomfortably close. The scholars argue, as always. Some say the plague cracked the social order wide open, letting women slip through the cracks into power they never had before. Others say the change was temporary, a blip in the timeline quickly smoothed over by patriarchal cement. You don't know what's right. You just know what you're seeing now. Alice is tired, you can tell. Her hands are rougher than they were, her posture more guarded. The crowds around her garden have thinned a little. A few of the men have returned from wherever they disappeared to. Travel, recovery, sulking, and they're less than thrilled to see how things have changed. One of them scolds her publicly for presuming too much. She doesn't respond, just keeps trimming her sage. But you know she heard it, and you know it stung. One evening you stop by her fence with a basket of early pears. You don't say much, just set them down where she can find them. She doesn't look up, but she nods. You think about all the women who kept things running while the world fell apart. The ones who buried their husbands, raised their children, ran the farms, healed the sick, and then, when it was safe, were told to go back to being quiet. You wonder what it feels like to carry the weight of survival, only to be asked to pretend it never happened. That night you write something down for the first time in ages. Just a few lines, names mostly. Elise, Margot the brewer, Nella the forge keeper, their voices, their choices, the way they refuse to wait for permission. You tuck the note into a crack in the wall, beside the candle you light each evening. A kind of vigil, not for the dead, but for the ones who kept living when no one expected them to. The road to the next town is surprisingly intact, no washed out bridges, no overgrown paths, just the that familiar crunch of gravel underfoot as you walk beneath a canopy of late summer leaves. You're not heading there for trade or news or even company. You're heading there because war doesn't care that half the continent just survived a catastrophe. It just continues. You first hear the rumours a few days earlier. A caravan of traders rolled through and mentioned a fresh flare-up in the war between England and France. The same war, mind you, that's been limping along for decades already. You lost track of which side is technically winning. No one really wins in a 100-year war. They just keep score with the dead. As you approach the outskirts of the town, you see them, soldiers, not many. A band of maybe 20 camped beside the main road. Their armours mismatched, dented, the shine long gone. Some wear pieces that clearly weren't made for them. One young man has a helmet so large it wobbles when he moves. Another sharpens a sword that looks more ceremonial than practical. These aren't knights. These are survivors with weapons. They're not bothering anyone. Not yet. Just eating, resting, waiting for orders, or maybe pretending they have orders at all. You've seen this type before. Mercenaries, freelancers of violence, men whose lives were broken by the plague and patched back together with coin and blood. Here's your historical fact. The 100 Years' War between England and France didn't pause for the plague. Not really. There were moments of truce, of course, and battles postponed due to outbreaks, but overall the war trudged forward, dragging two countries through cycles of invasion, retreat, rebellion, and reprisal. Soldiers who survived the pestilence didn't return home. They kept fighting. In fact, some historians argue the war grew worse in the aftermath because the economic vacuum left behind demanded new spoils to chase. You sit at a distance watching the group. One of them sings a low, tuneless ballad while another fiddles with a cracked piece of armour. They look more exhausted than dangerous. Not bloodthirsty, just hollow, like people who've forgotten how to stop fighting. And maybe that's what lingers hardest after a plague. Not just grief, not just fear, but momentum. The systems that were already in motion before the sickness just keep grinding forward, as if no one thought to pull the brake. You talk to a soldier by the stream. He says he was a farmer once, had a family, lost them all. He didn't want to fight, but someone handed him a spear and a ration, and it seemed easier than planting fields that no one would harvest. You offer him a piece of your bread. He takes it without thanks. Not rude, just numb. Further into town, the effects of war are easier to spot. Walls reinforced, young men missing, shops shuttered. A priest blesses a group of new recruits with hands that tremble slightly. The mayor's house has a banner hanging from the second-floor window, an emblem you don't recognise. A new allegiance, perhaps. These things change often now. But something else catches your eye. Rows of crosses in the churchyard. Not fresh graves, but recent. War dead, not plague dead. Someone is keeping the distinction even now. Fringe fact, in some areas plague victims were buried in mass pits, while war dead were given individual graves, if they were lucky. The reasoning? War had honour. The plague was shameful, never mind that both ended the same way. Cold, Jitterhogsbau. Silence. The stories we tell ourselves matter more than the facts. The innkeeper talks to you while you rest. Says the soldiers haven't caused much trouble, but everyone stays tense. One drunk soldier with a sword and something to prove can do more damage than the pestilence ever did. People carry on, but the smiles are thinner. Children play quieter. Weddings are smaller. You get the sense that even joy is holding its breath. Scholars love to argue whether the plague prolonged wars by destabilizing economies or shortened them by killing too many soldiers to continue. It depends on the war, on the day, on who's writing the history. But standing here, watching a boy no older than 15 try on a breastplate that doesn't fit, you're inclined to think the war never ends, just changes shape. You leave town the next morning passing the soldiers again. One of them has painted a crude skull on his shield. Another is sewing a red ribbon into his sleeve. Whether it's superstition or solidarity, you can't say. They nod at you as you pass. One says, "Safe roads," in a tone that suggests he doesn't believe in such things anymore. You walk back slowly, carrying new thoughts in your pack. Thoughts about how some people find meaning in rebuilding while others only know how to destroy. Thoughts about how violence, once unleashed, becomes self-sustaining. Thoughts about how war and plague don't compete. They collaborate. That evening, back in your village, you talk to a young man who's been thinking of enlisting. He says he has no work here, no family, no real reason to stay. figures if death is going to come for him, he might as well meet it with a sword in hand. Well, you don't try to talk him out of it. You just listen. He's not looking for permission. He's looking for direction. As the stars rise, you think of the soldiers you met. Their tired eyes, their dented armour, their campfire songs with no melody. You wonder who they'll be in a year, or if they'll be anyone at all. You place a candle on your windowsill before bed. Not for the dead, not for the soldiers, just as a small act of stillness, a reminder that not everything has to march forward. Some things can just be. You can't help but notice how heavy your money pouch feels these days, not because it's full of coins, but because the coins themselves are so absurdly bulky. You jingle it once, and it sounds like you're carrying a pocket full of old hinges. That's the thing no one mentions about life before modern banking. Wealth is loud. It clangs as it bruises your hip when you walk. It spills as embarrassingly onto the floor when you try to count it discreetly, and that's assuming you're using coins at all. More and more you're seeing people trade without metal, a sack of grain for a bolt of cloth, a promise of next season's lamb in exchange for shoe repair today. Even in larger towns, scribes are being asked to write out agreements, little slips of parchment promising payment later. Credit, they are calling it. IOUs with fancy handwriting. It feels strange but not unwelcome. You've gone from hauling silver pennies to quietly slipping someone a written promise backed by your name. It's less dramatic, sure, but far more convenient. Here's your historical fact. In the decades following the Black Death, as labourers gained more freedom and wages increased, Europe began to see a gradual shift toward more sophisticated financial systems. The use of coinage didn't vanish, but the concept of money as trust, paper or credit, loans started to spread. Towns developed local tally systems, merchants carried promissory notes, and banking families like the Medici in Italy began laying the groundwork for what we now call capitalism. All of this, quietly, was born in the wake of pestilence. You see it happening in your own village, even if no one calls it banking. The miller's wife started keeping a chalkboard tally for repeat customers. You owe her 4 loaves of bread, 2 pints of ale, and 1 favour involving fence repairs. She's not worried, you're good for it. Trust is currency now, but not everyone likes it. Some of the older villagers mutter about how real money has weight. They don't trust promises. Can't melt down a piece of parchment, they say. Can't bite it to check for silver. You catch one man actually trying to chew a wooden token someone gave him for a future goat rental. Spoiler. It doesn't taste like wealth. And then there are the coin clippers, little criminals with little knives, shaving tiny bits of silver off the edges of coins to melt down and resell. The government starts cracking down, of course, but it only proves how slippery value has become. Is this coin worth what it weighs, or what someone says it's worth? These questions feel philosophical until you're trying to buy cheese with a clipped groat and the cheesemonger just laughs at you. Fringe fact, in some towns, particularly those near trade routes, informal banks sprang up, often run by monasteries or merchant families, where travellers could deposit money in one place and withdraw it in another, using handwritten notes as proof. It wasn't exactly safe, but it was better than wandering around with your entire life savings jangling from your belt like a walking bell tower. You try it once, a promissory note. You're buying wool from a trader who's passing through and you don't have the coin on hand. So you write your name, the amount owed, and the promise to pay within 10 days. He accepts it with barely a glance, just tucks it into his pouch and moves on. It feels powerful, not in a kingdom shall tremble before me kind of way, but in a quieter sense, like you've just participated in something bigger than bartering, like you've joined a new game with different rules that favour literacy, reputation and timing over brute strength or noble birth. And that's the underlying shift you start to sense everywhere. Power is untethering itself from tradition. Once upon a time, power lived in land, in titles, in bloodlines and battlefields. But now, it's moving into numbers, into ledgers, into who owes whom and how much and whether the promise is good. The scribes are in demand again. Not for copying Bibles, but for keeping records. Debts, loans, agreements. Suddenly someone who can write has more influence than someone who can swing a sword. You even hear whispers that some towns are electing treasurers, a role with more real control than the mayor in some places, because when everything is in flux, the person who tracks the money quietly steers the ship. There's debate, naturally. Some folks argue that this shift toward written promises and complex trade will ruin the soul of the village, that credit is dishonest, that we're forgetting what it means to work for what we have. But these are mostly the people who used to benefit from the old system. where control meant locking up grain stores and demanding rent in coin. You think about your own little stash, a handful of silver pieces in a clay jar under the floorboards and a folded bit of parchment in your coat pocket that says someone owes you 6 sheep's worth of dyed wool by Michaelmas. One is heavy, one is light, but which has more value? You help a friend draw up a letter of credit one afternoon. He can't write, but he trusts you. You copy it neatly, slowly, letting the ink dry before folding the page. He takes it like it's a relic. You wonder if someday someone will look back at these scraps of paper and see the beginning of something massive, something modern. Something that started in a dusty room with bad lighting and a lot of hope. That night, as you sit beside your fire, you leaf through a few of the notes you've received. Promises, payments, agreements. They feel oddly personal, like echoes of conversations, like little monuments to trust in a world still learning how to believe in itself again. And you realise something quietly profound. The future might not be built with swords or sermons or even gold. It might be built with ink. You first notice it when the baker's son, barely 15, smudged with flour and always humming some tuneless little song, asks a question that freezes everyone mid-chew at the morning meal. He pauses, lifts his head and says, "But what if the stars don't decide anything at all?" His mother blinks. His uncle frowns. You, sitting with a bowl of barley stew and a half-burnt crust of bread, don't say anything. You just watch. That's when you realise something curious is happening. All over the village, in corners, in kitchens and fields, people are thinking, not just surviving, not just grinding through tasks, but wondering, questioning, rearranging the shape of old ideas like puzzle pieces that no longer quite fit. You see it later that day at the church, where a handful of older men gather beneath the stone archway, arguing not about politics or crops, or even taxes, but about time, specifically whether the calendar still matters when the feasts feel hollow, the saints unfamiliar, and the harvests come late or early like they're playing games. God's will, someone says. Or maybe, another replies, we just don't know how to read the signs anymore. You walk away before it gets heated, but the spark is lit. And it's not just talk. You find the evidence in quiet corners. A neighbour's child drawing constellations on the inside of the barn door. An old man copying lines from a weathered manuscript, stopping every few words to mouth them silently. Someone, not a priest, has built a sundial outside the blacksmith's hut. You pause to look at it. The shadow's wrong, but the intent is clear. People want to understand. Here's your historical fact. In the aftermath of the Black Death, universities across Europe saw a shift in focus. Theology remained dominant, sure, but interest in subjects like natural philosophy, astronomy, and medicine began to swell. Some scholars, previously bound to rote church doctrine, started questioning inherited truths. The trauma of the plague cracked open a door, and through it poured doubt, curiosity, and eventually revolution. It starts small, a shepherd's son asking why illness spreads faster in summer than winter, a mason wondering why stones crack in the same spot each year, a merchant who keeps track of which herbs keep pests away better, no matter what the prayer books say. These aren't professors, these are people with dirt under their nails and smoke in their hair. But they're doing what universities were built for. They're thinking about the world. Fringe fact, there's a tale, half myth, half history, of a woman in southern France who, after losing her family to plague, locked herself in her attic with a pile of books and emerged 3 years later claiming to have rewritten Galen's theories of the humours. Was she a genius? A crank? A grieving mother making sense of chaos through ink? Maybe all three, but her pages survived. They're still studied, tucked away in some dusty archive. Meanwhile, in the next town over, a physician sets up an open-air lecture in the square. He draws diagrams in the dirt explaining how fevers rise and fall like tides. People come to watch, to listen. Some heckle. Others ask questions. The idea of public learning, not just sermons, but actual testable ideas, is spreading like, well, maybe not the best metaphor considering. But you get the point. And this is where it gets fascinating. The educated class starts to feel a little twitchy. Not because they fear ignorance, but because they fear independent knowledge. Priests remind people that curiosity is dangerous, that too many questions invite heresy. One man in your village gets publicly shamed for suggesting the stars might influence weather more than morality. He doesn't argue, just quietly carves symbols into the beams of his roof that match no known saint. You begin to see the cracks in the walls of certainty. Scholars later debate whether the Black Death created a culture of inquiry, or merely accelerated one that was already brewing. Some say the trauma of mass death forced people to seek answers beyond doctrine. Others argue that with so many scholars dead, the survivors had more room to experiment, less oversight, more freedom. Either way, a strange new energy is surfacing, a kind of intellectual turbulence. Like the world is catching its breath before asking a very large question. You catch yourself doing it. Now, too, when the stars come out at night, you find yourself staring longer. Not praying, just wondering. Why does the moon change shape? Why do comets come and go? Is illness carried on the wind, or by touch, or by something invisible altogether? You think about the doctors who left leeches on your cousin's chest, who bled her till she turned grey. She died anyway. And suddenly, it's not sacrilege to wonder if they were wrong, if they're still wrong. You don't say it aloud, not yet, but the seed is planted. You visit a travelling scribe one afternoon who claims he's copied texts from Italy. New theories, new models, new ways of knowing. He shows you a diagram of the human body labelled not with saints' names, but with anatomical terms. You don't understand half of it, but you feel something shift. This isn't just survival anymore. This is a renaissance in its earliest breath. That night you light a candle and stare at a scrap of parchment you found weeks ago in an abandoned house. It's a table of numbers, maybe a ledger, maybe a chart of star positions, maybe nothing at all. But you stare anyway, because it makes you feel closer to something you can't name, not comfort, not faith, understanding. And in this strange new world, maybe that's the thing worth chasing. You hear the sound before you see it, a low thump, rhythmic and persistent, like someone slapping the ground with a book. You follow it past the baker's house down the alley, where the cobbler used to keep his goat tied, and there you find it, a press, a crude, heavy thing made of wood and iron, jammed into what used to be someone's storage shed. It smells like ink, dust and ambition, and beside it, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with smudges, is a man muttering to himself and carefully setting rows of tiny letters into a metal frame. You've seen writing, of course, scrolls, monastic texts, but this is different. These aren't copied bits from some archive hunched under candlelight for weeks. This is multiplication. Ideas, duplicated, fast, efficient, mechanical. The man sees you staring and lifts a freshly pressed page from a drying line overhead. He hands it to you with the sort of expression usually reserved for newborns. It's a pamphlet, a short prayer, a parable, a drawing of a skull, a quote from some preacher you've never heard of. You don't care what it says. You're still marvelling at the fact that it exists. There are dozens of identical copies stacked beside the press, like soldiers ready for deployment. Here's your historical fact. The earliest forms of movable type printing began appearing in Europe in the mid-15th century, just decades after the Black Death. While the Chinese and Koreans had experimented with printing centuries earlier, it was the European versions, particularly Gutenberg's press in the 1440s, that transformed information into something reproducible. And though your village doesn't have a Gutenberg, it's clear the ripple has begun. This press is modest, primitive, but it's changing everything already. The man, his name is Joran, says he got the idea from a traveller passing through Italy. He's teaching himself as he goes. And he's not even fully literate, but he doesn't need to understand the texts, he just needs to copy them. The ideas, he says, will do the rest. And that's the unsettling part. Because until now, ideas were slow, precious, locked in monasteries, spoken by priests, scribbled by scribes who could spend a month copying a single book. Knowledge had a gate and a gatekeeper, but now it's leaking through the cracks. Now, a shepherd might read a hymn by candlelight. A blacksmith might debate theology over ale. A farmer might learn to sign their own name. You walk away from the press that afternoon, with ink on your fingers and your mind buzzing. Not because of what you read, but because of what it means. If knowledge can be shared like bread, what happens to the people who used to control the oven? You start seeing these little booklets everywhere, tucked into windowsills, left at the market, dropped at doorsteps. Some contain prayers, others tell moral stories, riddles, even a gossip dressed up as wisdom. One booklet claims the stars predict a second plague. Another says the moon's phases dictate crop yield. They are not all accurate, but accuracy doesn't matter as much as access. The fact that you can hold a written idea in your hand changes something fundamental in your brain. Fringe fact, in the early days of print, many church officials opposed it, not because they feared books, but because they feared unauthorized books. Texts without oversight, without approval. A bad idea copied 100 times is harder to stamp out than a whispered heresy. So rules are made, bans are issued, printers are watched. But the presses keep running. Some towns respond with excitement. Schools open, reading spreads, others resist, clinging to oral traditions, warning that too much reading will confuse people. You hear about a man in the north who insists that teaching his daughters to read will summon demons. He's not joking. Ignorance, it turns out, has better PR than wisdom in some places. You stop by Duran's shed a few days later. He's printing again, this time a page of riddles and farming tips. More people want stories, he says. Not sermons, not laws, just stories. You help him hang the pages to dry, trying not to smudge the ink. You ask him where the words came from. He shrugs. Some from old books, some are made up. Doesn't that matter, does it? If people read them. And that's where the line starts to blur. Fact and fiction, truth and tale. The printed word gives weight to whatever it contains, even if it's nonsense. And suddenly, you realise the world's becoming not just more informed, but more persuadable. It's exhilarating. It's terrifying. And it's only just begun. Scholars will later debate whether the printing press was the single most important invention of the second millennium. Some argue it caused revolutions, religious, scientific, political. Others claim those revolutions were inevitable, and the press just accelerated what was already boiling. But from where you stand, ink-stained and slightly dizzy with the implications, it feels like watching fire be tamed for the second time. That night you read one of Duran's pamphlets by candlelight. The words aren't elegant, the grammar stumbles, but the story about a dog who outwits death by pretending to be a saint makes you laugh. You read it again, and then you fold it and tuck it under your pillow like a secret. You fall asleep with your head full of ink, stories, and the hum of new knowledge waiting to be set loose on the world. And somewhere nearby the press keeps thumping. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat made of paper and wood. The weight of time feels different now. Days still pass with the slow rhythm of chores and meals and weather, but something's off, like the calendar forgot how to behave. You're halfway through the harvest season, but the apples ripened early. Or maybe the wheat is late. You're not sure anymore. Seasons blur, feasts arrive before anyone's ready. The year feels unbalanced, like a wheel with a warped spoke. It isn't just you, everyone's a little unsure of what month it is, or even what year. Ask 3 people and you'll get 4 answers. Someone says it's 1355, someone else insists it's 1352. A third just shrugs and says, it's after the plague, after the dying, after the world twisted and cracked. That's what matters. Dates are for clerks and kings. It would be funny if it weren't so haunted. Because this confusion isn't just a matter of paperwork, it's emotional, psychological. You realise you're living in what could only be called a century-long hangover. Here's your historical fact. The generation that survived the Black Death is often referred to by historians as a trauma generation. They didn't just rebuild their lives, they did it under the lingering weight of mass death, existential dread and constant instability. Crops failed, villages collapsed, wars flared up and faded away, and through it all, people just kept going. Not because things got better, but because stopping wasn't an option. You're beginning to understand this firsthand. The post-plague years weren't a return to normal, they were a slide into something new, something unsettled. You wake up most mornings with a strange tightness in your chest, like your body still expects disaster. A cough in the next room makes you freeze. A dead bird on the path turns your stomach. You don't feel safe, even when you know you probably are. But what's stranger is how little anyone talks about it. Everyone you know is quietly grieving, sometimes people, sometimes time itself. You've met children born after the plague who still grow up shadowed by stories. They say things like, before it happened, or when the old village was still full, as if referring to a dream they never had but inherited anyway. You stop by the local chapel one morning and find the priest painting over an old fresco. The image beneath shows a field of corpses and angels lifting the dead skyward, a relic of the plague years, now being covered with soft pastoral scenes, sheep, sunrises, doves. People want peace now, he says, not reminders. You nod, but part of you wonders if peace without memory is just denial with nicer colours. Fringe fact, in some areas, survivors refuse to rebuild certain buildings destroyed during the plague, especially hospitals and pest houses. They feared the land itself was cursed. Whole city blocks were left to rot, while new ones were built a few streets away, like the trauma could be rerouted through different alleys. In your own town, there's a house no one will enter. It's not boarded up or chained, just avoided. The shutters hang crooked. The door creaks open and closed with the wind. You've never seen a soul go inside. When you ask why, people just say, "That's where it happened," and leave it at that. You don't ask again, but the hangover isn't all fear. There's restlessness too. Young people, especially those born after the worst of it, have this wild gleam in their eyes. Like they're trying to live twice as hard, to make up for the years stolen before they even had names. They drink deeply, love fast, argue louder. Some start leaving the village entirely, heading toward the cities, where rumours swirl about new guilds, new ideas, new ways to live without bending to the same old rules. You talk to one of them before she goes. She's 19, smart as a whip, hands calloused from weaving. She tells you she's tired of praying for rain and pretending she can't read better than half the monks. She wants something bigger, she wants to matter. You wish her well and you mean it, but as she walks away down the road you feel a strange pang, hope maybe, or envy. That's the paradox. The world is unstable, but it's also strangely open. The structures that once held everything in place, social class, labour, religion, even time itself, have all warped a little. Not broken, not gone, but definitely wobbly. And in the wobble, there's possibility. Scholars argue about whether this post-plague era was one of decline or growth. Some say it was a backslide into superstition and chaos. Others claim it was the dawn of a new age, of commerce, science, art, renaissance, they whisper, as if naming it too early might scare it off. But most agree on this. The generation that came after lived in a world without clear instructions, and that's what makes it both exhausting and exhilarating. You sit with your journal that night, the one you never planned to keep, but now can't seem to stop writing in. The pages are messy, some stained with grease or soot. A few entries don't make sense, but that's all right. It doesn't have to be elegant, it just has to be real. You write about the days that feel like progress, about the mornings when your breath comes easy, about the laughter in the tavern when someone tells a story so absurd everyone forgets how to cry. You write about confusion too, about forgetting birthdays, about losing track of which saints go with which feast, about how strange it is that so much of life now feels improvised. Before bed you light your candle and stare at the ceiling. You think of time as a river, muddy, fast-moving, overflowing its banks. You're not sure if you're floating or flailing, maybe both, but you are moving, you're alive, and for a generation climbing out of the wreckage, that's enough to keep going. You're on your way to the mill when you see it, a chicken in a hat. Not a metaphor, a real chicken, in a real hat. Someone, presumably bored, deranged, or hilariously creative, has fitted a tiny blue cap onto the head of a local hen. The bird pecks proudly through the mud, oblivious to the tiny buckle bobbing with every step. You stop, you stare, and just before you can process what you're seeing, a boy runs past yelling, "That's Lady Clucksworth III, and she owns half the village now." You blink. What? A few steps further, a man is arguing with a tree about property boundaries, loudly, passionately. He's waving a folded parchment in the air, insisting the oak has moved several feet west and is now encroaching on his cabbages. A nearby woman nods, muttering that she always knew that tree had shifty roots. And that's when it hits you. The laws are starting to go weird. Not evil, not oppressive yet, but weird. Improvised, overcomplicated, unenforced. The kind of laws that happen when half the people who used to enforce order are gone, and the ones left behind are just trying their best while possibly drunk and definitely overwhelmed. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, many regions in Europe experienced a legal vacuum. Local officials were dead, records were missing, inheritance lines collapsed, entire estates were abandoned, mismanaged, or falsely claimed. What followed was a flurry of legal improvisation, new rules, contradictory edicts, hastily redrawn boundaries, and lawsuits so confusing they made the actual plague seem straightforward by comparison. You start seeing notices posted on trees and tavern doors, declarations from lords who haven't been seen in years, tax codes written in Latin, then rewritten in bad French, then crossed out entirely. One sign announces that pigs are now required to wear bells. Another bans dancing after sundown unless supervised by a priest and a chicken. You suspect Lady Clucksworth is behind this. Of course, some of it's practical. With so many deaths, questions of ownership have spiraled into chaos. A widow lays claim to land her husband's cousin once tilled, but another man insists he has an oral promise from said cousin's goat. A merchant swears he owns the abandoned workshop near the river, but his only proof is a blood-stained scrap of fabric and a suspicious wink. The local magistrate, an exhausted man named Renard who used to be a cobbler, is drowning in disputes. He carries a ledger everywhere, but half the entries just read, or deal with this later. He holds court every week in the tavern, a setting not exactly known for sober jurisprudence. One man shows up with a fish wrapped in wax and insists it's legal tender. Renard sighs, buys him a drink, and makes a note to revisit fish-based currency laws at a later date. Fringe fact, in some towns during this period, people formed customary courts, hyper-local assemblies where villagers settled disputes through tradition, memory, and loud opinions rather than formal law. They were democratic in spirit but deeply flawed in execution. Think town hall meeting meets chaotic improv troupe. Occasionally brilliant, often ridiculous, but better than nothing. It's not just property disputes either. Labour laws are unravelling. Marriage laws are confused. Guild rules are rewritten every other month. You know a woman who was technically married twice in 1 week because no one could find the right documentation the first time. She jokes that she has 2 husbands now and is just waiting for whichever one remembers to bring firewood. You see the strain everywhere. People are trying to rebuild structure on a foundation that's still cracking beneath them. Sometimes it works. A group of neighbours agree to rotate livestock grazing rights and draw up a shared map. Other times, it's a disaster. One man tries to start a private toll gate across a public path and ends up pelted with cabbages. But occasionally something fascinating happens. Out of the confusion, new ideas slip through. Ideas that would have been laughed out of the hall a few years ago, like shared ownership, debt forgiveness, community votes, even, whisper it, fair wages for everyone regardless of birth. The system's messy, but it's pliable, and in that pliability, people experiment. Of course, the old powers aren't thrilled. Lords start sending letters, grand declarations sealed in wax, reminding everyone that their land still technically belongs to someone very important. The letters arrive months late and are mostly ignored. Occasionally a noble shows up in person, waving a sword and demanding fealty. More often than not, they leave with fresh eggs and a slightly confused expression. Scholars argue whether the legal chaos after the Black Death permanently reshaped European governance. Some say yes, it broke the back of feudalism, introduced concepts of individual rights, and set the stage for modern statehood. Others argue the weirdness was temporary. A necessary stumble before the status quo reasserted itself. But if you've ever seen a man fined for insulting a goose, it's hard to believe anything is truly temporary. You sit in on a community council one evening, 10 people around a table in the alehouse, debating whether a communal ox should be allowed to sleep inside the grain barn. There's passionate discourse, there's a vote. The ox wins by a narrow margin. You leave the meeting in awe, slightly drunk and strangely hopeful. That night you lie in bed thinking about all the rules you've followed without question. The invisible lines drawn by people long dead. The always and never and must that shaped your life. And now, watching the world write its rules in real time, even the ridiculous ones, you wonder what it might mean to have a say. Maybe the laws aren't broken, maybe they're just unfinished. The art is darker now, not in that brooding, mysterious way that makes people stroke their chins and whisper about symbolism, but literally darker. Shadows stretch longer in paintings, eyes are hollow, even the saints look exhausted. And then there are the skeletons, so many skeletons, dancing, laughing, playing fiddles, kissing nuns, skeletons in crowns, skeletons on stilts, skeletons leading long parades of the living toward open graves. You don't even blink when you see them anymore. You just nod like, yeah, that tracks. It's everywhere. On church walls, in prayer books, carved into the corners of coffins. Even the tapestry in the merchant's house down the lane has a strange little skull peeking out from behind a basket of pears. You asked him about it once. He shrugged and said, "Memento mori," like it was just another spice in the stew of life. Remember, you must not die. A casual reminder embroidered right next to the family crest. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, European art took a macabre turn. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular theme, showing death personified as a skeleton leading people of all social classes into the grave. Kings, priests, merchants, beggars, none spared. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Art stopped being just about beauty and became about truth, harsh, unavoidable truth. You see it in the faces of new statues. Gone is the serene, stylized perfection of earlier times. Now the Virgin Mary has bags under her eyes. The crucifixion scenes show blood that actually drips. Even the angels look like they've been through something. There's a rawness in it all, a visual confession that beauty without suffering feels dishonest. But then, just when you think art has given up completely, something shifts. You walk into a chapel one afternoon, expecting the usual funeral grey palette, and instead find gold leaf. A lot of it. It clings to the halos, the robes, the wings of angels painted so delicately you wonder if they might sigh and flutter off the wall. And the faces, they aren't tired. They shine. They aren't smug saints or blank expressions. They look real, kind almost, like they've seen the same things you have, and somehow still believe in grace. You sit down on a bench and just stare. It's jarring seeing hope like this after so much visual despair, but it's not naive hope. It's the kind of hope that emerges after ruin, the kind that knows what it costs. Fringe fact, in some parts of Europe, particularly in Italy, a style known as International Gothic emerged post-plague. It blended the dark emotional tones of the previous decades with newfound elegance, rich colour, and almost absurd levels of ornamentation. Think gold-threaded robes, idealised faces, heavenly symmetry. It was like the artist said, "Fine, if we have to live, let's really live." And it wasn't just churches. Rich merchants began commissioning private altarpieces, illuminated manuscripts, even portraits, something unheard of for commoners a century earlier. Art moved out of monasteries and into homes. Everyone wanted to see themselves reflected in pigment and light, even if they had to be standing beside a skeleton. You stop by the workshop of a local painter named Willard. He's not famous, just precise. His studio smells of oil, wood shavings, and whatever strange things he mixes into paint. He's working on a panel depicting St. Michael weighing souls, but instead of perfect symmetry, he's added a detail, a tiny mouse crawling along the scale chain, tipping the weight towards a damnation. "For fun," he says, "art should surprise you." You nod. Willard is weird, but he's also brilliant. He once painted a Madonna holding a crying infant and added smudges on her sleeve where the child's tears had dried. Everyone who saw it stopped and said the same thing. I've seen that look. Realism is creeping in, not just in lines and colour, but in emotion. People are no longer satisfied with flat symbols and distant saints. They want to feel the story. You see it in woodcuts that depict not just Judgment Day, but the everyday struggle, ploughing, childbirth, feasting, mourning. One image shows a man sitting beside an empty plate staring into the fire. No caption, no context, just a moment of recognisable human ache. You ask Willard why art changed so much. He doesn't even look up. "Because we changed," he says. "We saw what lies beneath." And that's the thing. The Black Death ripped the veil off the world. It showed everyone, peasants, painters, priests, that life is not guaranteed, that death isn't a poetic metaphor. It's a person, waiting patiently at the edge of every frame. So the artists adapted. Some gave death a face. Others gave life more colour. Scholars will later debate whether this era marked a decline in faith or a deepening of it. Some will argue that painting a corpse beside the Virgin is blasphemous. Others will say it's the purest kind of devotion, an honest one. A faith that doesn't hide from pain, one that includes it. And you just feel grateful that the art speaks your language now. You visit the chapel again a few days later. The gold still shines, but this time you notice the background. The hills behind the saints are dusted with brown. The sky is cloudy. The plants have thorns. Even the light looks like it might go out. But the saints smile anyway. You sit there until the candle burns low, and when you stand to leave, you don't feel lighter exactly, but you feel seen. And that might be enough. You notice it first in the silence. Not the peaceful kind, like after a rain or just before dawn, but the watchful kind, like the world has gone quiet to listen. One new has arrived in the village. You catch sight of them on the far side of the square, just as they step into the baker's shop. A little too well dressed, boots too clean, cloak too fine, and definitely not from around here. You feel the shift immediately, conversations dull. Doors close just a little faster. Children are called inside. The villagers don't scowl exactly, but their bodies stiffen. Smiles are more cautious. You can almost smell the suspicion in the air, sharp and metallic like blood under your fingernails. It's not just this one person. It's all strangers now. Travellers, traders, wandering clergy, foreigners, anyone who doesn't have a face you grew up with. Before the plague, outsiders brought news, excitement, occasionally fleas, but now they bring tension. Or worse, questions. Where were they when it happened? What do they want now? Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, xenophobia surged across Europe. People blamed outsiders, foreigners, Jews, lepers, women, witches for the spread of the disease. Entire communities were scapegoated, exiled, or worse. In 1348, Jewish populations in multiple cities were massacred, accused of poisoning wells or summoning the plague with dark magic. Fear turned neighbour against neighbour. Suspicion became policy. It never went away. You hear someone whisper that the new traveller is a spy, or a tax collector, or worse, a healer who brings curses with him. The stories balloon fast. One moment he's buying bread, the next he's being accused, quietly, of course, of carrying a disease that hasn't surfaced in years. You don't believe it. Not really. But still, when he passes you on the road and tips his hat, you flinch just a little before nodding back. That's what fear does. It doesn't always make you cruel, it just makes you smaller. Makes you fold into yourself like a seed bracing for winter. You don't want to hate anyone, you just don't want to risk anything. And the traveller isn't the only target. There's a woman in your village with a birthmark on her cheek that looks vaguely like a crow's foot. She's lived here for years, but lately people glance at her sideways. They say she didn't get sick during the plague. They say her cat talks. You know her. She's kind. She once gave you soup when your fire went out, but when she walks past the well, someone spits on the ground, just in case. Fringe fact, the late 14th century saw a rise in witch trials across Europe, especially in places where the plague had struck hardest. The logic was twisted and cruel. If someone survived while others didn't, surely they must have had unnatural protection. Herbs, midwifery, unusual knowledge, all once signs of wisdom, became potential evidence of evil. The woman with the birthmark, she stops coming to the market. You find out later she moved to the edge of the woods, built a garden, lives alone. Some say it's because she's hiding, others say it's because she's plotting. You walk by her cottage one day just to see, and there she is, kneeling in the dirt, humming softly while she pulls weeds. She looks up, meets your gaze, and smiles with her whole face. You wave back, but even as you do, you feel the tug of discomfort. Not because you believe she's dangerous, but because it's easier to keep your head down, to blend, to not be the one who defends the outcast when the firewood starts vanishing and people want someone to blame. There's talk of witches again. There's always talk of witches when the harvest is bad or someone's child runs a fever. You remember last year, when a travelling merchant's horse fell dead in the square, and 3 people claimed it was cursed by a woman's glance. You rolled your eyes, but you also stepped away, quietly. You think about that more than you'd like to admit. Some scholars argue that the paranoia following the plague was just psychological debris, grief and trauma looking for a scapegoat. Others believe it was deliberately weaponized by those in power, a way to redirect public anger away from failed leadership and toward vulnerable targets. Either way, it left a legacy, a habit. You start hearing new laws passed in distant cities, bans on heretical gatherings, edicts about keeping foreigners in designated quarters, taxes on migrants who want to trade or settle. It starts small, reasonable sounding, for the public good. But you've seen where it leads. One day it's a toll booth, the next it's a bonfire. Even in your own town, subtle lines are drawn. People stop inviting the herbalist to weddings. The family with Moorish ancestry gets overlooked for council votes. A man from the next village, just a few miles away, is accused of theft before anyone checks his bags. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to feel possible. And what's worse? You can feel it in yourself too. Not hatred, not violence, just hesitation. Just that quiet voice that says, maybe wait a moment before trusting him. Just in case you hate that voice, but you can't unhear it. So you fight it in small ways, a kind word, a shared loaf, a note left by the herbalist's door, thank you for the soup, it's not enough, it's never enough. But it's a beginning. That night you walk to the edge of the village and look out across the hills. Somewhere out there, other towns are drawing the same lines. Other strangers are being whispered about. You wonder how many people are sitting by fires tonight, holding their breath, wondering if they'll be next. The stars are cold and distant. You whisper a blessing not to any saint, but just into the night itself, not for safety, for decency. The merchant's house has shutters the size of church doors, thick oak carved with vines and lions and things that have never existed. You've walked past it 100 times, always wondering what the inside looks like. Today you get a glimpse, not because you're invited, but because the front door is wide open and a scribe is pacing the front garden in circles, swearing quietly to himself and clutching a bundle of papers like they might spontaneously combust. You pause. He spots you. "Insurance," he mutters, waving the stack. "It's the new thing. Everyone wants it. No one understands it." Then he ducks back inside, leaving you standing there like someone who just overheard a royal conspiracy involving barn owls. Insurance. It's a word that feels strange in your mouth, like chewing on coins, but once you hear it, you start hearing it everywhere. The merchant wants to insure his next shipment of wool. A widow down the road paid a travelling scribe to write a contract guaranteeing a set sum of coin to her daughter if she dies of plague, or accident, or heartbreak. She made him include heartbreak. Suddenly death has a price tag, and so does loss, and so does not dying. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, especially in the merchant hubs of Italy and the Low Countries, early forms of insurance began to spread rapidly. Trade was riskier than ever, bandits, storms, disease. So merchants started paying premiums to cover their goods. If the ship sank, they'd get their money back. If it didn't, well, peace of mind came at a price. It was the beginning of risk management in writing, a formalized legal way to tell the universe, "I dare you." You meet a man in the tavern who claims he's a risk broker, which sounds more like a pirate than a profession. He has a ledger full of names and numbers and very little hair. People think it's magic, he says. It's not, it's just math and bad news. You buy him a drink and ask what the catch is. He says the catch is always in the fine print. Then he passes out in his stew, but you get the idea. Insurance is security, for the future, for your family, or for your property, but it's also a gamble. You're betting something bad might happen, and someone else is betting it won't, and in between those two wagers lies an entirely new way of thinking about the world. You see it most clearly in the marketplace. A man selling imported spices now offers spoilage protection for an extra fee. A blacksmith offers a 1-year guarantee on horseshoes. A midwife whispers about a guaranteed healthy birth contract, though she still insists the paperwork can't replace the saints. Is the same chant over and over. You can't stop bad things, but you can get paid when they happen. Fringe fact, in certain cities, entire guilds sprang up around insurance. They'd pool money to protect members. If one died or lost their home, the others chipped in, like a social safety net with a ledger and a wax seal. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. Of course, not everyone's sold. Old villagers wrinkle their noses at the idea of betting on their own mortality. "If I'm gonna die," says one old woman, "I want it to surprise me." The local priest warns that trying to profit from God's will is a sin wrapped in velvet. He might be right, or he might just be annoyed no one's insuring his sermons. You try it yourself. Sort of. You write a simple agreement with your neighbour. If your crop fails this season, he'll give you a sack of grain. If his cow dies, you'll give him a goose. You both sign it, seal it with thumbprints, and hide it under a jug in the pantry. It's clumsy, informal, but it makes you both sleep easier. The future feels slightly less like a spinning wheel aimed at your teeth. The problem, of course, is enforcement. The courts are still overwhelmed. The law's a mess. If someone breaks an insurance contract, you'd better hope the village council is in a good mood or that the wronged party owns more pitchforks. But people are doing it anyway, because even the illusion of safety is better than nothing. Scholars will later call this the birth of actuarial thinking, assigning numbers to risk, pricing uncertainty, transforming chaos into coin. They'll say it paved the way for capitalism, modern finance, even the welfare state. But you're not thinking about any of that when you scribble your own version of a will on a scrap of parchment and fold it under your mattress. You're just trying to stop the spinning in your head every time someone coughs. Later at the market, you overhear a mother bargaining with a merchant over a tiny necklace. She wants it insured, not for its value, but for the meaning. "It was my daughter's," she says, "and if it's lost, I'll want the weight back, even if it's in silver." The merchant agrees, half out of empathy, half because she's visibly armed with a rolling pin. That night, you dream of contracts, of letters sealed in wax and floating through the sky like paper birds. You dream of rooms full of ledgers, where men in robes argue about decimal points while storms crash outside. You wake unsure if the dream was comforting or terrifying. You go to your window, press your forehead to the cool glass, and whisper a thought that's been lingering in your mind since the first time you heard that strange new word. What if hope could be made legal? The wheat field you pass on the edge of town doesn't look right. It's not empty, it's just wrong. The soil's been turned, the stalk's barely knee-high. But it's not wheat growing there anymore. It's grass. Wild, careless grass. You stop and watch as a few sheep munch happily along the far edge, their wool thick and matted, like they've never seen shears or rules or fences. A few years ago, this land fed dozens, now it feeds sheep. And no one's surprised. You walk a little farther and see another field that's been converted, this one fenced in, dotted with small shelters. More sheep, more wool, less grain. The pattern repeats across the countryside. Grain fields are disappearing. Wheat, barley, rye, once the cornerstones of every meal, are being slowly replaced by bleating, muddy, soft-eyed animals who contribute nothing to bread but everything to blankets and coin. Here's your historical fact. Following the Black Death, the price of grain collapsed due to low demand and high availability. Simultaneously, the price of wool soared. Fewer people meant fewer mouths to feed, but Europe still needed textiles, and sheep, it turns out, are far less complicated than people. They don't need wages or weddings or sermons. They eat, they grow, and they get sheared. You pass by a woman mending a wall and you ask whose land this used to be. She shrugs. The baker's brother, maybe, or the church, or nobody. That's the thing, ownership is blurry now. And since land that lies fallow often invites trouble, people are quick to claim it, fence it, and cover it in wool. Sheep farming is booming, quietly, without parades or declarations. You remember when everyone talked about rebuilding, schools, granaries, churches, but no one said anything about this. This subtle conquest of the countryside by animals too polite to make a fuss. Fringe fact, in some places, sheep were accused of ruining civilization. Not by biting, of course, but by being profitable. Sheep farming required fewer labourers, which meant landowners could profit without employing peasants. This led to mass displacement, early forms of enclosure, and what some historians half-jokingly refer to as the sheepification of England. It wasn't a bad move financially, but socially it got messy. You walk into the next village and see the signs, more fences, fewer people, houses boarded up or turned into barns. One cottage has its front door removed entirely, used as firewood maybe, and a pig lounging inside like he owns the place. The church still stands, but the congregation's down to 5, and 3 of them are asleep. It's not that people are vanishing again, it's that the rhythm of life is shifting. Wheat required communities, planting, harvesting, milling, baking. It was a cycle that demanded hands, voices, shared labour. Sheep need grass, and one bored man with a stick. It's efficiency, yes, but it's lonely. You talk to an older man sitting on a tree stump sharpening a scythe that hasn't seen wheat in 2 years. He says he remembers when the fields behind his house were golden, when the harvest festival meant something. Now it's just sheep and silence. He misses the noise, the work, the sense that he was part of something that fed more than just mouths, but then he shows you a pouch of silver coins, payment from the local wool merchant, enough to buy good boots, warm ale, and maybe fix the roof. It's better, he says, just not the kind of better I wanted. That's the debate now. Is this new order progress or decay? Some argue that wool means wealth, more trade, more surplus, fewer famines. Others point to the empty fields and shrinking villages and ask, at what cost? You hear about a town nearby where the entire population left, not from plague, not from war, but because the land was sold for sheep pasture. The villagers were paid to go or simply forced to leave. The town still has a name, it still has a bell, but no one hears it anymore. You return home that evening, passing once again by the fence where sheep now graze. One of them looks up at you and blinks slowly, chewing without urgency. It doesn't care about history. It doesn't care about tradition or community or the taste of bread hot from the oven. It exists, quietly profiting from the absence of everything that used to matter. The scholars will later call this the dawn of agrarian capitalism. The pivot from subsistence to profit, from communal farming to individual gain. They'll write long papers about land consolidation and the commodification of animals. But standing here, watching a dozen sheep graze on what was once a family's livelihood, it doesn't feel like economics. It feels like a long, slow forgetting. Still, You can't deny the benefits. Your cloak is warmer this year. Your boots are lined. The wool merchant in town is hiring apprentices, offering real coin. For those who adapt, there's comfort. For those who don't, well, sheep don't care about unemployment. That night you sit by the fire, spinning a bit of wool and thread. You learned how last winter. It's meditative, easy. The thread is strong, soft, oddly satisfying. You think about baking bread and realise you haven't done it in weeks. You don't miss the flour under your nails, but you do miss the smell. You finish your thread and tuck it into a basket. Then you close your eyes and picture the old fields, golden, noisy, human. They're gone now, replaced with something quieter, more profitable, more sheepish. And you wonder, just for a moment, if the future is warm, but somehow a little too quiet. You wake up with a pit in your stomach, not the kind that comes from hunger, but from knowing something is off. The sky looks normal, the wind moves the trees the way it always does, but there's this heaviness in the air, like it's all pressing down on you, waiting. You felt it before, though you didn't have words for it then. It's that strange, creeping dread that whispers, the world might end again. No one says it out loud, of course. Everyone's tired of endings, but it's there, floating just beneath every prayer, every clink of the ale mug, every time someone glances over their shoulder at a sky that looks a little too red. You go about your morning feeding chickens, checking the roof tiles, trading gossip for a loaf of bread, but the feeling stays, the unspoken when instead of if. You're not alone in it. In town you hear mutterings about omens again. Someone says the moon was too bright last night. Someone else claims the well water tastes strange. A travelling friar preaches from atop a barrel that this is only the beginning of the reckoning. People don't stop to listen, but they don't laugh either. They just keep walking with that same look in their eyes, half haunted, half ready. Here's your historical fact. In the century after the Black Death, Europe experienced several additional plagues, famines, earthquakes, and bizarre weather patterns. People came to believe that they were living through the end times, not once, but repeatedly. Millennial panic wasn't isolated to the year 1000. The 1300s and 1400s were thick with apocalyptic dread. Sermons, artwork, and literature all reflected the sense that the world was on a countdown to something cataclysmic, and honestly, who could blame them? Every thunderstorm feels louder now, every illness more suspicious. One child coughs, and 4 households light candles. There's a superstition circulating that if you say the word plague out loud, it'll hear you. You catch yourself whispering the sickness instead, even though you're not a particularly superstitious person. It's a cultural hangover, this fear. Deep, marrow-level stuff. Even the songs have changed. What used to be bawdy, rhythmic tunes about harvests and lovers now carry odd little lyrics about fire and shadows and angels with broken wings. You try humming one of the old tunes in the tavern, and it feels out of place, like laughing during a funeral. Fringe fact, several movements sprang up after the plague centred around apocalyptic prophecy. Some groups believed the Antichrist had already come. Others thought the end was being delayed until people had time to repent properly. There were self-appointed prophets who claimed to see signs in everything, from cloud formations to the way a chicken scratched at the dirt. Some were harmless, others not so much. You meet a man who walks from village to village with a banner showing a burning city, carried by skeletons on horseback. He says he painted it himself, after dreaming the image during a fever. He talks about judgment, about flames, about the sins of humanity reaching a boiling point. He's not foaming at the mouth. He's calm, methodical, terrifyingly convincing. And people believe him. Not because he makes sense, but because the alternative, that all the death and loss and chaos was random, is worse. You start noticing how this fear is shaping decisions. A young couple postpones their wedding because it doesn't feel like a good time. A merchant sells off his goods and joins a monastery, convinced the world won't last another 5 years. You hear of entire families moving to remote hillsides, trying to outrun fate with sheep and prayer. And yet somehow life continues. You help patch a neighbour's roof. You exchange a string of garlic for a tin spoon. You watch the village children chase a pig through the square, shrieking with laughter. It doesn't look like a society teetering on the brink, but you can feel the tension, like the moment before a storm, the hush, the readiness. You sit one night beside the fire with an older woman who lived through the worst of the plague. She's quiet, not one for storytelling, but that night she says something you'll never forget. We all thought it would end, she says. The world, I mean. But it didn't. And that's the hardest part. It just kept going. You ask her what she means. Endings are easier than endurance, she says, stirring the embers. There's no planning in the end, no hoping, just surrender. But when you keep waking up, when the world refuses to die properly, then you've got to start living with the weight of what didn't happen. You don't sleep much that night. The next morning the sky is blue and too bright. The tavern opens on time, the mill turns. But still, that low hum of dread buzzes in the background. You see it in the way people glance at the sky, in the way they grip their cups, in the way they pause just a little too long at the door before stepping outside. You begin to suspect that the apocalypse isn't a single event, it's a state of mind, a season of the soul. And once it arrives, it never quite leaves. You spend the afternoon carving a new window shutter. You plant herbs. You teach a child how to shape bread dough into a bird. You write a letter you won't send. Because if the world's going to end again, you want to go out having done something. The bells ring for something other than death for once. You almost don't recognise the sound. It's too upbeat, too insistent. For months, the church bell has only tolled for plague anniversaries, funerals, or one alarmingly dramatic goat stampede. But today it's different. Quick, bright, almost playful. You follow the sound to the square, half expecting another doomsday preacher or a cart selling miracle onions, but what you find is much stranger. A festival. Not an accidental one, like when someone drinks too much and the bakery catches fire and everyone ends up dancing to put it out. No. This one is planned. Tables have been dragged into the square. There's bread. There's stew. Someone is tuning a lute with great seriousness and very little talent. Children are painting their faces with soot and crushed berries, while a woman sews ribbons to a goat's tail. You blink, not because it's surreal, but because it feels familiar. The way things used to be, and yet it's not quite the same. The colours are brighter, but the smiles are more fragile. You can tell people are out of practice. They laugh a little too loudly, eat a little too fast, dance like their knees forgot how to be joyful. Still, it's happening. Life, as a concept, is pushing its way back in. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, many parts of Europe began slowly reviving their cultural traditions. Feast days, festivals, market fairs. But they came back altered. Some celebrations took on darker tones, blending religious joy with grim reminders of mortality. Others became louder, more chaotic, like people were trying to shout over the memory of death. The revelry returned, but it always carried a shadow. You wander through the crowd, watching villagers negotiate this strange, rusty joy. There's a juggler, a real juggy or juggler. His act consists of throwing apples into the air and catching half of them, but the crowd applauds like he's just cured plague with hand-eye coordination. A woman with a lute sings a song about spring that has clearly been rewritten. New lyrics about survival, about bones in the ground, about the way moss grows on gravestones. It's beautiful, and a little disturbing. You see people you haven't seen in months. Some look thinner, and some look tired. One boy has a streak of white in his hair that wasn't there before. You ask about it. He shrugs and says, "I saw things." Like that explains it. And honestly, it kinda does. A strange man with a painted mask walks through the square ringing a bell and announcing riddles. Every time someone gets one wrong, he throws a handful of flower petals in their face and shouts, "You're forgiven!" The rules are unclear, the riddles are worse, but somehow it works. People laugh, real laughter. Bent over, tear-streaked, can't catch your breath laughter. You feel something loosen in your chest. And then, just when it starts to feel normal, someone starts crying. You don't even know why. Maybe they saw something in a song. Maybe the stew reminded them of a sibling. Maybe it was just too much, too fast. They sit in the grass and sob into their knees. No one scolds them. A few people sit nearby, quietly. Not to fix anything, just to be there. It's strangely comforting. Like joy and grief have learned to sit at the same table, elbowing each other for space. Fringe fact. In some post-plague festivals, it became customary to include a moment of silence for the dead usually at sunset. Bells would stop, music would pause, and people would turn toward the horizon to remember. Then, after a moment, the noise would return louder, wilder, not to erase the grief, but to honour it by outliving it. As the sun lowers behind the hills, someone lights a massive bonfire. It sputters at first, then roars. Sparks fly into the deepening sky. Children dance around it. Adults pretend not to be dancing, but definitely are. An old man stumbles into the firelight with a jug of something he calls plague juice, which turns out to be wine, vinegar, and whatever he could scrape off the back of his cupboard. It is not good, but it is extremely effective. You catch yourself smiling. The masked riddle man walks past you and says, "Surprised to see it again, aren't you?" You ask what? He gestures to the crowd. The future. You want to say something clever, but you're too choked up, so you just nod. Later, when the music softens and the air grows cooler, you sit near the edge of the square with a hunk of bread and a cup of water that might technically be wine now. Across the fire, you see the woman with the birthmark, the one people whispered about. She's talking to a child, showing them how to plait grass into a little bracelet. For once, no one is avoiding her. No one is watching her out of the corner of their eye. They're just letting her be. You stay until the last song is played, until the last ember fades. People drift home laughing, holding hands, singing half songs from half memories. There's a moment, just one, where you feel okay. Not healed, not whole, but okay. You walk back through the quiet streets, past shuttered homes and sleeping goats. The air smells like ash and ale and flowers. You know the fear will return, the hunger, the uncertainty, maybe even the plague itself. But tonight you are human again. And maybe that's the most radical thing anyone can be in a world that tried so hard to unmake you. It starts with a rumour, as these things always do. A cousin of a friend of a merchant says that a man in Florence has been painting real people. Not saints, not kings, not gods, but ordinary men and women. Wrinkled, blinking, hands dirty from work. And somehow they matter. The story spreads like fire through kindling. At first you dismiss it. Artists paint what they're paid to paint. But then you hear another story. A young sculptor in the city has carved a statue of a naked man. Not a holy one, not a dead one, just a man. Tall, balanced, perfect in the way lightning is perfect. Sharp, dangerous, and entirely out of place in the quiet rubble of post-plague life. Then someone brings you a small booklet. Hand-bound, smells like oil and candle smoke. Inside, in shaky ink, are sketches of machines, cogs, gears, bridges, wings, as if people might fly someday. The sketches are absurd, wonderful. You flip through them with a strange ache in your chest, like you're watching someone dream too loudly. And that's when you feel it. The shift. It's not just survival anymore. It's not even healing. It's awakening. Here's your historical fact. Many historians argue that the Renaissance, the literal rebirth, was accelerated by the trauma of the Black Death. As old systems collapsed and wealth was redistributed, new opportunities for the education, creativity, and individual expression emerged. In cities like Florence, Siena, and Venice, art and science weren't just preserved, they exploded. People turned inward, then outward, and when they looked again at the world, they didn't just see God, they saw themselves. It's unsettling at first. For generations, art and learning served one purpose, to glorify heaven. Now it's glorifying hands, eyes, muscles, people. Even floors are being painted, moles, scars, stubby fingers. Not hidden, celebrated. You stare at a sketch of a peasant woman's feet, dirty, cracked, beautifully rendered, and you can't explain why it moves you so deeply. You start hearing new names in the street, passed like secrets. Giotto, Petrarch, Boccaccio. You haven't read their work, but the way people say their names is different. Reverent, but not holy, like saints of the mind. One morning, the village blacksmith, who's never spoken more than 3 words to you outside of "it's done," shows you a page from a borrowed manuscript. It's a poem, about loss, about survival, about a flower blooming where a corpse once lay. He doesn't say anything, just hands it to you like a gift and walks away. You keep the page folded in your sleeve for days. Fringe fact, Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron is one of the foundational works of Renaissance literature, wrote it during and after the plague years. It's a collection of 100 stories told by 10 young people who flee Florence to escape the sickness. The stories are tragic, absurd, comic, romantic, but what they share is their humanity. They are not sermons, they're life. Raw, unruly, unfiltered. You borrow a copy. Crude, hand-copied, Half the page is smeared and you read it in secret, feeling like you've found a doorway out of the dark. It's not that the stories deny death, they don't, but they laugh at it. They live through it. They're not about martyrs or miracles. They're about people like you, tired, confused, alive anyway. And slowly, you notice something else. The children in your village are asking better questions. Not, what did we lose, but what can we build? A young boy carves patterns into wood just to see what happens when the grain splits. A girl catches bees in a jar, not to kill them, but to watch how their wings work. A man you know, half blind from fever, starts painting with crushed berries on linen scraps. His work is terrible, but it's his. The world isn't just coming back, it's coming back different. Braver, stranger, smarter. You overhear a merchant arguing with a priest. Something about the soul, about whether God requires suffering or whether maybe he just wants us to create. They don't reach a conclusion, but the fact that they're arguing at all in public without anyone being burned alive, that's new. Even the architecture changes. Old stone chapels are patched up with coloured glass. Arches stretch wider. Buildings reach toward the sky like they've remembered they were allowed to. You visit a nearby town and see a public square covered in painted tiles. No saints, no dragons, just people. Dancing, laughing, existing. The scholars will call this a cultural revolution. They'll say it reshaped the West, that the horrors of the Black Death cracked the world open, and outpoured science, beauty, doubt, and possibility. They'll chart it neatly in books and timelines. But from where you sit, in a village still stitching itself together, it feels messier. Less like a revolution and more like a garden growing where nothing should grow. You look around and realize that the questions that people are asking have changed. Not, what is God's will? But what is my will? Not, how do we survive? But, how do we make it mean something? And there it is. The plague ended a long time ago, but its fingerprints are everywhere. Not in rot, but in rebirth. In the drawings pinned to barn walls, in the half-finished songs, in the broken wagon turned into a stage for a play no one understands, but everyone applauds anyway. Death tried to wipe the slate clean, but instead of fading, the people picked up chalk and started drawing again. You stay up late that night, hunched over a scrap of paper. You're not an artist, you're not a writer, you barely know how to hold the pen, but you draw something anyway. A house, a goat, a child, a sun. It's terrible. You smile at it anyway, because this too is part of it. Not just surviving, not just remembering, but creating, even when no one asks you to, especially then. You're sitting in the courtyard, sun on your face, when the comet appears. It slices across the sky just after sunset, bright enough to make the villagers gasp out loud. Children cheer, elders squint. One man drops his ale and crosses himself so fast he almost dislocates a shoulder. You stare at it, long, glowing, impossibly fast, and you feel, for a fleeting second, like the sky is winking at you, or warning you, or both. You'd think by now people would be used to strange phenomena. After everything, the plague, the earthquakes, the famine, the rumours, the flagellants, the bread riots, you'd think a streak of fire in the sky wouldn't rattle anyone. But it does, because deep down, no matter how modern things feel, people still think the heavens are watching. And when the heavens move, they assume someone down here has messed up. Here's your historical fact. In the 14th and 15th centuries, comets were still widely regarded as omens, harbingers of plague. War, death, or divine punishment. The most famous of the time, Halley's Comet, appeared in 1456 and was so terrifying to Europeans that Pope Calixtus III reportedly ordered prayers and even an exorcism against it. Because when in doubt, yell at the sky. But not everyone panics. A young man near you squints at the comet and starts sketching it in the dirt with a stick. "It's beautiful," he says. "I wonder what it's made of." His mother hisses at him and drags him inside by the ear. "That's how the plague starts," she mutters. Still, the question lingers. What is it made of? You start noticing people asking questions like that more often now. Not just what does it mean, but how does it work? They're small questions, curious questions. What makes fire? Why do some herbs soothe fevers and others make you hallucinate that your goat is plotting against you? Why does rain fall hard after thunder? Where does the sun go at night? They sound innocent, but they're not. They're cracks in the wall. You meet a woman named Alessa who's been collecting bones, not for ritual or superstition, but for study. She wants to know how joints work. why some heal crooked. She has a shelf in her cottage full of carefully cleaned skulls, vertebrae, ribs stacked like books. She speaks gently, but her mind is sharp. The body isn't mysterious, she tells you. We just haven't looked close enough. Fringe fact, dear. Many post-plague thinkers began challenging medieval medical orthodoxy, especially the theory of the four humours. Autopsies, previously taboo, started to be performed more frequently, especially in cities like Padua and Bologna. Surgeons and physicians, now desperate to explain why some people died while others lived, slowly edged away from Galen's ancient teachings and began asking dangerous questions like, but what if that's wrong? You visit a travelling apothecary who lets you hold a magnifying lens. It's crude, wobbly, barely better than a glass marble. But when you look through it at a leaf, you see details you've never noticed. Veins, tiny hairs, patterns like a secret language. You hand it back slowly, stunned. The apothecary smiles and says, the world isn't smaller than we thought. It's bigger. This is the beginning of something. People still pray, still burn candles, still tie charms to doors and whisper to saints, but now they're also writing things down, measuring, observing, sketching insects, boiling roots and comparing results, not to replace faith, but to sit beside it, tapping its fingers and whispering, and what else? It's subtle at first, a few notebooks, a few thinkers, but it's spreading, you can feel it, just like the art changed, just like the music softened. The questions are shifting now too. The scholars of the future will say this was the dawn of empiricism, the slow exhale before the scientific revolution. They'll name Copernicus, Vesalius and Da Vinci. They'll draw timelines and trace influences, but to you it's quieter than all that. It's just a child asking why frogs croak more in spring. It's just a midwife wondering why certain herbs ease childbirth better than prayer. It's just someone in a dusty room lighting a candle, opening up a shut page, and thinking maybe we don't know everything yet. And the beauty of it is, nobody has to ask permission anymore. For too long, knowledge was owned by priests, by guilds, by kings. But after the plague, the cracks in that system never fully closed. Once books became cheaper, and people started thinking for themselves, the dam couldn't hold. Curiosity is contagious. And now, it's airborne. You sit one evening with a neighbour's son, a boy who once struggled to spell his own name but now spends his afternoons drawing the phases of the moon. He points at the sky and tells you, I think it's just a rock, a big one. But I don't know yet. You don't laugh, you just listen, because that's the thing, the world isn't done breaking, but it's not done rebuilding either. And you've started to realise something. This rebuilding isn't about making things the way they were. It's about making things better, freer, truer. That night you sit beneath the sky and look for the comet again. It's faded, gone behind the horizon, but you still feel its echo. The mark it left behind isn't in the stars, it's in the questions people started asking because of it. You don't have the answers, not yet, maybe not ever, but for the first time in a long time, you believe it's worth looking,